Max trembled in the corner of his kennel, body pressed against cold concrete as visitors passed without a glance. His once proud German Shepherd frame now tucked into itself, military-trained muscles remembering only how to cower. Then came the little girl with hearing aids, her small fingers moving in patterns through air. The shelter fell silent. "He's scheduled for euthanasia tomorrow," the attendant whispered to the grandmother. "Combat trauma, doesn't respond to anyone." But the impossible happened. Max's ears perked forward, his amber eyes locked with the child's blue ones, and his tail offered one hesitant wag. The shelter worker dropped her clipboard. "My God, that's the first time he's acknowledged a human in 3 months." The grandmother clutched her purse tighter, wedding ring glinting, the same one her canine officer husband had worn before a German Shepherd couldn't save him. What connected this broken child and broken dog? And could either survive the coming storm without the other? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Wilson hadn't planned on visiting the animal shelter that sweltering Virginia afternoon. At 67, with arthritic knees and a fixed income stretched thinner each month, adding a pet to her responsibilities seemed foolish. But Emma had been so persistent, her blue eyes pleading above her hearing aids, small fingers signing please with increasing urgency each day. How could Margaret refuse the child who had already lost so much? It had been 3 years since the accident that took Emma's parents, Margaret's son and daughter-in-law, and most of Emma's hearing. 3 years of nightmares, speech therapy, and the particular silence that fell between a grieving grandmother and a traumatized child. The social worker had suggested a pet might help Emma connect again. Margaret had delayed until today, Emma's 8th birthday. "Just to look," Margaret had insisted that morning, watching Emma carefully select her outfit, a blue dress her mother had bought her, now almost too small. The child, who rarely showed emotion, had practically vibrated with excitement on the drive over. Now, watching Emma's unexpected connection with this broken military dog, Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The shelter itself reminded Margaret of the field hospital she'd worked in during Vietnam, the antiseptic smell barely masking more organic odors, the mixture of hope and despair hanging in the air. She'd been a combat nurse then, patching up boys barely old enough to shave, sending some home and closing the eyes of others. Later, she'd married John Wilson, a police officer with the K-9 unit, until a German Shepherd just like this one had failed to protect him during a robbery gone wrong. "His name is Max," the shelter attendant, Bethany according to her name tag, was saying. 7 years old. "Came to us through a military discharge program. The paperwork's pretty sparse, but he's got some kind of service record." Margaret nodded stiffly, watching Emma sink to her knees outside the kennel. The child, who refused to make eye contact with her teachers, was now staring directly at a dog that outweighed her by at least 70 pounds. "We don't recommend him for families with children," Bethany continued, lowering her voice. "Combat dogs can be unpredictable, and this one has issues. Trembling, hiding, won't eat sometimes. Startles at loud noises." Just like Emma, Margaret thought, remembering how her granddaughter still dove under the bed during thunderstorms. From down the corridor came the sharp voice of Eleanor Whitfield, president of their neighborhood association and Margaret's longtime adversary. Of course, Eleanor would be here today, probably donating blankets while simultaneously ensuring the shelter enforced strict adoption policies. Margaret instinctively stepped between her and Emma. The last thing they needed was Eleanor witnessing this connection and finding another reason to suggest Margaret wasn't fit to raise her granddaughter. What Margaret couldn't know then was how this moment, this dog, would soon divide their entire community and force her to confront ghosts she'd spent decades trying to forget. "Emma, honey, let's look at some of the other dogs." Margaret tried to keep her voice light, even as her pulse quickened at the sight of the German Shepherd. Max reminded her too much of Ranger, the police dog that had returned home without John that terrible night. The dog they'd had to re-home because Margaret couldn't bear to look at him. Emma didn't respond, her focus entirely on Max. Her small fingers moved in the deliberate patterns of American Sign Language she'd learned after the accident. Margaret recognized the signs for friend and hello. Bethany's eyebrows rose. "Is she deaf?" she asked, using the blunt terminology of an older generation. "Hearing impaired," Margaret corrected automatically. The accident damaged her auditory nerves. The aids help, but she prefers signing when she's nervous. As if responding to this explanation, Max's ears twitched forward. The trembling in his haunches subsided slightly, and his amber eyes tracked Emma's moving hands with unsettling intelligence. "That's unusual," Bethany said, frowning. "He hasn't shown interest in anyone since he arrived. Most people can't even approach his kennel without him retreating to that corner." Emma turned to her grandmother, her blue eyes alight with an excitement Margaret hadn't seen in years. She signed rapidly, her small face animated. "He understands me, Grandma. He knows signs." Margaret translated for Bethany's benefit, then shook her head. "Sweetheart, I don't think dogs understand sign language. He's probably just responding to your movement." But Emma was insistent, signing again toward Max. To Margaret's astonishment, the dog's posture changed. He straightened slightly, head tilting in a gesture that seemed almost attentive. "Well, I'll be," Bethany murmured. "Military dogs are sometimes trained to respond to hand signals in combat situations. Makes them effective in operations requiring silence." A deep voice behind them added, "Especially dogs from certain special units." Margaret turned to find an older man in a white coat watching them with interest. His silver hair was cropped short in a style that suggested old military habits, and his name badge identified him as Dr. James Harrington, veterinarian. "I was just coming to check on Max," he explained, eyes lingering on the dog with something like recognition. "We're running out of options for him, I'm afraid." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. Dr. Harrington's expression softened. "We have a 7-day policy for animals with severe behavioral issues, especially larger breeds. Max has been here for 6 months under special consideration because of his service record, but county regulations and our limited resources—" He trailed off, glancing at Emma, who was still focused entirely on Max. "You're going to put him down," Margaret finished flatly. The veterinarian nodded. "Unless we find placement by Friday. It's not a decision anyone's happy about, but he's not responding to rehabilitation efforts, and we can't in good conscience adopt him to a typical family." Emma, despite her hearing aids, had a child's uncanny ability to follow adult conversations that concerned her. Her head whipped around, eyes wide with alarm. She signed frantically to Margaret. "No, they can't kill him. He just needs someone who understands him." Margaret translated reluctantly, embarrassed by her granddaughter's outburst. Dr. Harrington crouched to Emma's level, his movements careful and deliberate. "You seem to understand him pretty well, young lady. Would you like to meet Max properly, in our interaction room?" Before Margaret could protest, Emma was nodding vigorously. Bethany looked uncertain. "Dr. Harrington, given Max's history—" "I'll take full responsibility," he interrupted, with an authority that silenced further objection. To Margaret he added, "Sometimes these animals just need the right person. I've seen it before." 20 minutes and several liability forms later, they sat in a small room with padded benches. Margaret perched nervously on the edge of her seat, while Emma sat cross-legged on the floor. Dr. Harrington and Bethany stood by the door, watching carefully as another staff member brought Max in on a short leash. The German shepherd entered cautiously, his nails clicking on the linoleum. Up close, Margaret could see the gray beginning to frost his muzzle and the thin scar tissue visible through the fur on his left flank. His military training was evident in his movements, precise and measured even in his anxiety. "Let him approach you," Dr. Harrington instructed softly. "Don't reach for him." Emma nodded, keeping her hands in her lap. She simply watched as Max circled the perimeter of the room, sniffing cautiously. When he finally approached her, it was with his head lowered, ears flattened submissively. Then Emma did something that made Margaret's heart clench. She slowly raised her right hand and formed a specific gesture, not standard ASL, but something that looked almost like a military signal. Max froze. His entire demeanor shifted. He straightened, ears forward, eyes alert. "Where did she learn that?" Dr. Harrington asked sharply. Margaret shook her head, bewildered. "I have no idea." Emma formed another gesture, and to everyone's astonishment, Max lowered himself to a sitting position, his eyes never leaving her face. "That's a tactical command," Dr. Harrington said quietly, "part of specialized K-9 training." Emma was beaming now, looking up at the adults with vindication. She signed rapidly to Margaret. "See? He understands. He's smart." The interaction continued for 20 minutes, with Emma somehow communicating with Max through a combination of standard signs and intuitive gestures. By the end, the German shepherd was lying beside her, his massive head cautiously accepting Emma's gentle pats. When they finally left the interaction room, Eleanor Whitfield was waiting in the lobby, her thin frame rigid with disapproval as she took in the sight of Emma hand in hand with Margaret, followed by Dr. Harrington. "Margaret," she acknowledged stiffly, "I didn't expect to see you here today." "Hello, Eleanor," Margaret replied, with the forced pleasantness of decades-long neighborhood friction. "Just looking." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Emma, her expression softening slightly, as it always did for the child. "Happy birthday, Emma. 8 years old today, isn't it?" Emma nodded, then signed a thank you that Margaret translated. "We have some wonderful small breeds that would be perfect for a quiet home," Eleanor said, the implication clear in her tone. As a shelter board member, she was well aware of their interaction with Max. "Actually," Dr. Harrington interjected, "I was just discussing a foster-to-adopt option with Mrs. Wilson for one of our special cases." Eleanor's thin eyebrows rose toward her immaculate silver bob. "Surely not the military dog. Margaret, you can't possibly—" "We haven't decided anything," Margaret cut in, squeezing Emma's hand in warning as the child began to protest. "We're just exploring options." Dr. Harrington walked them to the door, speaking quietly once Eleanor was out of earshot. "I don't usually advocate this strongly, but I believe Max may respond to Emma in a way he hasn't to anyone else. Would you consider a 3-day trial fostering? If it doesn't work out, you can return him. No questions asked." Margaret looked down at Emma's hopeful face, then back at Max, still visible through the interaction room window. He was watching them leave, his posture alert but anxious. "I'm a 67-year-old woman with bad knees and a hearing-impaired child," Margaret said plainly. "That dog outweighs Emma by 70 pounds and has combat trauma. It would be irresponsible." "With all due respect, ma'am," Dr. Harrington replied, his voice taking on the formal tone of military address, "sometimes the wounded recognize each other. They speak a language the rest of us don't understand." Emma tugged at Margaret's hand, her expression pleading. She signed slowly, making sure her grandmother caught every word. "Please, Grandma. 3 days. He needs us." Margaret thought of her empty house, of Emma's nightmares, of the silence that had filled their lives since the accident. She thought of John, who had believed in the bond between humans and dogs with an almost religious conviction. 3 days, she finally agreed. But at the first sign of trouble, he goes back. The paperwork took another hour. Eleanor made a point of walking past them twice, her disapproval radiating like heat. By late afternoon, they were loading Max into Margaret's aging Buick. The German Shepherd perched tensely on a blanket in the back seat. As they pulled out of the shelter parking lot, Margaret caught sight of their reflection in the rearview mirror. A white-haired woman, a small blonde girl with hearing aids, and a battle-scarred military dog. What an unlikely trio they made. "This is temporary," she reminded Emma, who was twisted around in her seat, watching Max with fascination. "Just 3 days." But something in her heart, the part that had once been a young nurse who believed in healing against all odds, whispered that nothing about this situation would be temporary. When they turned onto Maple Street, their neighbors were out watering lawns and chatting across driveways in the late afternoon heat. Activity paused as Margaret's car passed, curious eyes following them. By morning, the entire neighborhood would know about Max. Eleanor would make certain of that. As they pulled into the driveway of the modest ranch house John had bought 40 years ago, Margaret steeled herself for what was to come. One way or another, their lives had just changed irrevocably. That first evening with Max was a study in cautious navigation. Margaret watched as Emma meticulously showed the German Shepherd each room of their modest ranch house, signing enthusiastically as though giving a grand tour to an honored guest. Max followed with military precision, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors, ears alert but body still tense. "This is where you'll sleep," Emma signed, pointing to the dog bed Margaret had hastily purchased during their stop at the pet store. She had placed it in the corner of the living room, far enough from both their bedrooms that any nighttime disturbances might be minimized. Max approached the bed cautiously, sniffing its edges before looking back at Emma as if seeking approval. "It's okay," she signed, her small face earnest. "It's yours." Margaret prepared dinner with one eye on the pair, marveling at her granddaughter's patience. Emma, who could barely sit through a 30-minute television show, spent almost 2 hours gradually acclimating Max to his new environment. She showed him where his water bowl sat in the kitchen, demonstrated how the back door opened to the fenced yard, and carefully established boundaries, pointing to areas where he could go and gently redirecting him from others. "He's very smart, Grandma," Emma said aloud, one of the rare occasions she used her voice since the accident. Her speech had the slightly flattened quality common to those who couldn't fully hear themselves, but the excitement made her words clearer than usual. "Yes, he is," Margaret agreed, setting plates on the table. "Wash up for dinner now." As Emma disappeared down the hallway, Max stood uncertainly in the middle of the living room, his amber eyes tracking Margaret's movements with wary attention. "I'm not entirely comfortable with you either," Margaret told him quietly, meeting his gaze. "But we're going to try, for her sake." After dinner, Margaret opened the hall closet to put away a jacket and froze. On the top shelf sat a cardboard box labeled John K9 Unit in her late husband's blocky handwriting. She hadn't opened it since his death 15 years ago. With Emma occupied giving Max small pieces of chicken as treats, against Margaret's better judgment, she quickly closed the closet door, unwilling to revisit those memories tonight. At 9 o'clock, after Emma's bath, Margaret supervised their nighttime routine. Emma signed good night to Max, who watched attentively from his bed. "Remember, he stays in the living room," Margaret reminded her as she tucked Emma into bed. "If he makes any noise or seems upset during the night, you come get me immediately. Don't try to handle him yourself." Emma nodded solemnly, then signed. "He won't hurt me, Grandma." "He's just scared. Even scared dogs can be dangerous, sweetheart," Margaret replied, brushing Emma's damp blonde hair from her forehead. "Promise me." "I promise," Emma signed, then added unexpectedly in speech, "Thank you for Max." Margaret's throat tightened. "It's just for 3 days, remember?" We'll see how it goes. After Emma fell asleep, Margaret sat in her recliner with a cup of tea, watching Max. The German Shepherd hadn't settled on his bed, but instead lay alert near the front window, his head positioned to monitor both the front door and the hallway leading to their bedrooms. "Standing guard?" Margaret asked softly. "That's not necessary here." Around midnight, Margaret finally retired to her bedroom, leaving the door cracked open so she could hear any disturbance. She fell into an uneasy sleep, dreams mixing memories of field hospitals with images of John in his police uniform. The thunderstorm began around 3 in the morning, an unexpected summer squall that arrived with little warning. Margaret awakened to a tremendous crack of thunder and lay still, automatically counting seconds until Emma would appear at her bedroom door, frightened by the noise she felt more than heard. But no small figure appeared. Instead, Margaret heard a different sound, a low, keening whine punctuated by frantic scratching. She threw back the covers and hurried down the hallway. The living room was empty, Max's bed abandoned. Heart racing, Margaret checked the front door, still locked, then followed the sounds to Emma's bedroom. What she found stopped her in the doorway. Max was pressed into the far corner of Emma's room, his large body trembling violently, eyes wide with terror as another thunderclap shook the house. But it wasn't his presence in the room that shocked Margaret. It was Emma. The child who had been nearly mute for 3 years was kneeling before the terrified dog, speaking aloud in a soft, steady stream, while her hands signed complimentary reassurances. "It's okay, Max. You're safe here. The thunder can't hurt you. I don't like it either. See? I can't hear it very well with my aids out, but I can feel it. It's scary, but not dangerous." Emma's hearing aids sat on her bedside table, yet she was speaking, imperfectly but clearly, to the traumatized dog. As Margaret watched, Emma slowly extended her hand, palm up, and waited. After several moments, Max inched forward and pressed his muzzle against her fingers. "Good boy," Emma murmured. "Brave boy." Margaret remained frozen in the doorway, witnessing a breakthrough she'd begun to believe would never come. All the speech therapists and child psychologists hadn't accomplished what this damaged German Shepherd had in less than 12 hours. She must have made some small sound because Max's head whipped toward her, body tensing again. Emma followed his gaze and spotted her grandmother. "Max is scared of storms," she signed, her expression serious, "like me." Margaret nodded, unsure whether to enforce the "no dog in the bedroom" rule or acknowledge the miracle unfolding before her. "I see that. Is he calmer now?" Emma nodded. "Can he stay with me tonight? Please. I told him he's safe here." Looking at the pair, the small girl in her faded butterfly pajamas and the battle-worn military dog gradually relaxing under her touch, Margaret made a decision that would have been unthinkable just that morning. "Just for tonight," she said softly. "But he stays on the floor, not on the bed." Emma's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. She patted the rug beside her bed, and Max cautiously settled there, his large body still vibrating with tension, but his eyes now fixed trustingly on the child. Margaret returned to her room but didn't sleep. Instead, she retrieved the photo of John she kept on her nightstand, smiling in his police uniform, Ranger sitting proudly beside him, and whispered, "What have I gotten us into, John?" The next morning, Margaret awoke to find Emma's bed empty. Alarmed, she hurried to the living room, only to find Emma sitting on the floor beside Max's bed, reading aloud from a picture book while the German Shepherd watched with what could only be described as attentive interest. "He likes stories," Emma announced when she noticed her grandmother. "And he ate all his breakfast." Sure enough, Max's food bowl was empty, a significant improvement from the shelter's reports of his poor appetite. Margaret had to admit the dog looked marginally better this morning, his posture slightly more relaxed, eyes more alert than haunted. "That's good," Margaret said cautiously. "Why don't you get dressed while I make breakfast?" "We need to go to the grocery store today." As Emma disappeared down the hallway, Margaret's phone rang. Eleanor Whitfield's name flashed on the screen. With a sigh, Margaret answered. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Margaret." Eleanor's voice was crisp. "I'm calling to inform you there's an emergency HOA meeting this evening at 7. I expect you to attend." "What's the emergency?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "We've received multiple concerns about a potentially dangerous animal in the neighborhood, specifically a military dog with PTSD in a home with a child." "We've had Max less than 24 hours, Margaret said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "And he's been nothing but gentle." Nevertheless, the covenant is clear about dangerous breeds and animals with aggressive histories. Section 8, paragraph 3 specifically states, "I'll be at the meeting, Eleanor," Margaret interrupted. "But I'll remind you that this is a temporary fostering situation, approved by a licensed veterinarian who deemed Max safe for our home." After hanging up, Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly exhausted. The HOA had been Eleanor's personal fiefdom for 15 years, and she wielded the covenant like a weapon. John had often joked that Eleanor missed her calling as a Cold War spy, given her talent for surveillance and regulations. The day progressed with surprising smoothness. Max remained close to Emma, but showed no signs of aggression or excessive anxiety. When they ventured into the backyard, he moved with increasing confidence, investigating the perimeter of the fence with methodical attention before settling in the shade to watch Emma's imaginative game involving her doll and several plastic dinosaurs. Margaret found herself relaxing incrementally, even allowing herself to smile when Emma demonstrated how she had taught Max to shake hands in just one morning. The German shepherd offered his paw with dignified restraint, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. By late afternoon, Margaret was making dinner when a sharp knock at the front door sent Max into sudden alert. His body stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he positioned himself between Emma and the potential threat. "It's okay," Margaret said quickly, moving toward the door. "Emma, hold Max." To her surprise, Emma made a sharp gesture with her right hand, and Max immediately subsided, though he remained vigilant. It was another of those military commands Margaret didn't recognize, yet Emma somehow knew. Margaret opened the door to find Frank Patterson, their 70-year-old neighbor and a Korean War veteran, standing on the porch. "Evening, Margaret," he said, nodding politely. "Heard you got yourself a military dog. Thought I'd stop by, see if you need any help." Before Margaret could answer, Frank's eyes widened as he looked past her. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "That's a Delta dog." "A what?" Margaret asked, turning to see Max watching them intently from Emma's side. "See that small mark on his ear? That's not a regular military canine. That's from one of the special tactical units." Frank's roomy eyes showed newfound respect. "What's his name?" "Max," Margaret replied, bewildered by this unexpected support. "How do you know about these things?" Frank tapped his temple. 30 years in Army intelligence. You learn to recognize certain things?" He knelt slowly, his arthritic knees cracking. "Hello there, soldier," he said to Max in a respectful tone. To Margaret's astonishment, Max approached Frank cautiously, sniffed his outstretched hand, then permitted the elderly man to gently touch his head. "Extraordinary animal," Frank murmured. "Whoever handled him trained him well." He looked up at Margaret. "Eleanor's on the warpath about him. Thought you should know I'll be speaking in your favor tonight. Several of us vets will." Relief flooded Margaret. "Thank you, Frank. I appreciate that." After Frank left, Margaret was helping Emma set the table when she noticed the child staring intently at something. Following her gaze, Margaret saw that Max had settled near the hallway, his attention fixed on something hanging from the coat rack. With a start, Margaret realized it was her old nursing uniform, preserved from her Vietnam days and recently aired out for a veterans memorial event. The sight of it seemed to have triggered something in Max. His posture had changed, head tilted in what appeared to be recognition. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked softly, approaching slowly. Max rose and moved toward the uniform, sniffing it intently. Then, to Margaret's shock, he sat down directly before it, his posture shifting to military alertness. "He recognizes it," Emma signed excitedly. "The uniform!" Margaret reached out tentatively and touched the faded uniform, memories flooding back, the heat, the constant sound of helicopters, the endless parade of broken young men on her operating table. As her fingers brushed the fabric, Max made a soft sound, almost a whine. "Did you know nurses like me?" Margaret asked him gently. "Over there?" For a fleeting moment, something passed between them, a shared recognition of wounds visible and invisible. Then the moment broke as Emma came to stand beside them, her small hand finding Margaret's. "See, Grandma? He knows you're a helper, too." That evening, Margaret left Emma with Mrs. Abernathy from next door and attended the HOA meeting with a curious mix of dread and determination. The community center was unusually full, with at least 30 residents present instead of the usual disinterested handful. Eleanor called the meeting to order with officious precision, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she cited chapter and verse of the neighborhood covenant. "The issue before us is clear," she concluded. "A potentially dangerous animal has been introduced to our community without proper vetting or approval." Several residents nodded in agreement, particularly those with small children or grandchildren. Margaret felt her chances of keeping Max, even temporarily, slipping away. Then Frank Patterson stood up, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Point of order," he said firmly. "I'd like to speak on behalf of Mrs. Wilson and the dog in question." Eleanor's lips thinned, but she nodded curtly. "2 minutes, Mr. Patterson." Frank addressed the room with quiet authority. "Most of you know I served in Korea and later in Army intelligence. What you may not know is that I worked extensively with military K-9 units during my career. The dog Margaret has taken in is not just any German shepherd. He bears the markings of an elite tactical unit, dogs specially trained for complex operations and extraordinary loyalty." A murmur went through the room. Frank continued, "These animals save American lives. They detect explosives, protect their handlers, and demonstrate intelligence beyond what most of us can comprehend. If this particular dog has bonded with young Emma, that's not a threat. It's a blessing. He'll protect that child with his life." Dr. Harrington, who Margaret hadn't noticed sitting in the back row, stood next. "As the veterinarian who approved this placement, I can confirm Mr. Patterson's assessment. Max's issues stem from trauma, not aggression." In the right environment, with proper understanding, these dogs can recover and become exceptional companions. The meeting devolved into heated debate. Some residents supported Margaret, citing property rights and personal freedom, while others backed Eleanor, emphasizing community safety and property values. Throughout, Margaret remained silent, observing the battle lines being drawn over a dog she'd only agreed to foster for 3 days. Finally, Eleanor rapped her gavel. "We'll put it to a vote. The board proposes that Mrs. Wilson be given 7 days to either return the animal to the shelter or prove through professional assessment that it poses no threat to community safety." The motion passed narrowly, with Eleanor casting the deciding vote. As people filed out, she approached Margaret with a tight smile. 7 days, Margaret, not a day more." "Thank you for your concern, Eleanor," Margaret replied evenly. "I'm sure it comes from a good place." Eleanor's expression flickered. For a moment, something like genuine emotion crossed her features. "My son served too, you know. Not all of them came home whole." Before Margaret could respond, Eleanor had turned away, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. On the walk home, Dr. Harrington fell into step beside Margaret. "You've got a week," he said quietly. "Make it count." "I only agreed to 3 days," Margaret reminded him. "This is getting complicated." Dr. Harrington smiled slightly. "Life's complicated, Mrs. Wilson, but sometimes the most complicated beginnings lead to the simplest truths." He paused at the corner where their paths diverged. "Check Max's collar more carefully when you get home. There's more to his story than I initially shared." Margaret returned to find Emma and Max both asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by the child's picture books. Mrs. Abernathy reported that Emma had read stories aloud to Max for nearly 2 hours, the most the child had spoken since the accident. After Mrs. Abernathy left, Margaret gently woke Emma and sent her to bed. Then, remembering Dr. Harrington's words, she carefully examined Max's collar in the quiet living room. Hidden inside the fabric, she found a small, weathered metal tag. It wasn't his official military identification, which the shelter had removed. This was something personal, something that had somehow remained with him through his journey. Engraved on the small disc were the words, "Never leave a man behind," and a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to Margaret. As she studied it, Max awoke and watched her with those intelligent amber eyes. For the first time, Margaret wondered what he had seen, what missions he had undertaken, what bond he had shared with his handler before everything fell apart. "You're quite the mystery, aren't you?" she whispered. In response, Max rose and moved to the front window, assuming the same guard position he'd taken the previous night. Watching him, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a recognition that perhaps they had been brought together for reasons beyond Emma's birthday wish or Dr. Harrington's intervention. 7 days to prove Max wasn't dangerous. 7 days that, though Margaret didn't know it yet, would unearth secrets long buried and forge connections none of them could have anticipated. The next morning, Margaret awoke to find Emma and Max already in the backyard. Through the kitchen window, she watched as her granddaughter demonstrated elaborate hand signals that the German Shepherd followed with increasing confidence. Gone was the trembling creature from the shelter. In his place stood an attentive animal whose military bearing became more evident with each passing hour. "He remembers his training," Emma explained proudly when they came inside for breakfast. "I'm just helping him remember it's okay to use it." Margaret set a plate of scrambled eggs before her granddaughter. "And how exactly do you know these commands, young lady?" Emma shrugged, her eyes sliding away in the manner they always did when she was evading a direct question. "I just try things. He understands." It was implausible, this connection between a traumatized military dog and a hearing-impaired 8-year-old. Yet Margaret couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. Max shadowed Emma with protective vigilance, positioning himself between her and potential threats: the mail carrier, a passing car that slowed near their driveway, the lawn service working at the Hendersons' house across the street. After breakfast, Margaret retrieved the box labeled John, K9 Unit from the hall closet. She hadn't opened it since his funeral, unable to face the memories it contained. Now she spread its contents across the dining room table: training manuals, certificates, photographs of John with Ranger at various stages of training, a worn leather lead, and a small notebook filled with John's precise handwriting. The notebook contained training notes and observations about Ranger's progress. As Margaret flipped through it, certain phrases caught her eye. "Responds best to consistent hand signals. Forming strong bond. Follows even without verbal commands. Protection instinct very strong. Needs regular reassurance that family members aren't threats." The parallels to Max were unmistakable. Margaret found herself taking notes, creating a list of strategies John had used to help Ranger adjust to home life after his initial police training. Her research was interrupted by the telephone. Dr. Harrington's voice greeted her when she answered. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm calling to check on Max's adjustment. Any issues I should know about?" "He's doing remarkably well," Margaret admitted. "The change since yesterday is dramatic. He and Emma seem to have developed their own communication system." "I thought they might," Dr. Harrington replied, an odd note in his voice. "Listen, I've arranged for a friend of mine to evaluate Max next Monday, a specialist in working with military K-9s. If his assessment is positive, it should satisfy the HOA's requirements." "That's very kind, but I only agreed to a 3-day foster period," Margaret reminded him. "Tomorrow would be the 3rd day." There was a pause on the line. "Mrs. Wilson, Margaret, I hope you'll consider extending that period. What's happening between Max and Emma is unusual. In my 30 years of veterinary practice, I've rarely seen such rapid bonding." After hanging up, Margaret watched Emma and Max through the window again. They were playing an elaborate game involving Emma hiding small objects and Max finding them, his nose working efficiently despite his earlier training for more serious detection work. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, that Margaret's chest ached with a familiar mixture of grief and hope. Emma hadn't played like this since before the accident. She hadn't spoken this much or laughed this freely. The child who had retreated into silence was emerging, drawn out by a dog who understood what it meant to be trapped between worlds. Later that afternoon, while Emma napped, a rare occurrence that testified to her increased activity level, Margaret sat on the porch with Max beside her. The German shepherd maintained his alert posture, ears swiveling to track neighborhood sounds, but his body lacked the rigid tension of their first day together. "You're good for her," Margaret admitted quietly. "I haven't seen her this engaged since before." Max's amber eyes shifted to her face, displaying that uncanny intelligence that still unnerved her slightly. "I'm not entirely comfortable with you yet," she continued, feeling only marginally foolish for confiding in a dog. "German shepherds have difficult associations for me." Ranger had returned home without John after the convenience store robbery gone wrong. The dog had been injured trying to protect his handler but had survived. Margaret, consumed by grief, couldn't bear to keep him. The department had rehomed him with another officer, and Margaret had never inquired about him again. Another abandonment to add to her list of regrets. "But Emma needs you," she concluded, "and I need whatever helps Emma." As if understanding the weight of this confession, Max shifted slightly closer, not making contact but reducing the distance between them. It was, Margaret realized, a gesture of respectful acknowledgement. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Max immediately positioned himself between Margaret and the potential threat, his posture alert but not aggressive. When Margaret opened the door, she found Frank Patterson standing on her porch with a small paper bag. "Afternoon, Margaret," he greeted, nodding respectfully to Max. "Brought some homemade dog biscuits, my late wife's recipe. Used to make them for the K-9 units when they visited the schools." Margaret invited him in, touched by the gesture. Frank settled into the armchair while she made coffee, Max maintaining a polite distance but watching the visitor attentively. "Been thinking about that tag on his collar," Frank said, accepting the mug Margaret offered. "Those numbers and letters? That's a unit designation, special ops." Margaret tensed. "What does that mean, exactly?" Frank sipped his coffee before answering. "Means Max here wasn't just any military dog. He was part of an elite team. Those dogs cost the government upwards of $30,000 to train. They don't usually end up in civilian shelters." "Dr. Harrington mentioned his paperwork was sparse," Margaret said, glancing at Max. "You think there's more to his story?" "Almost certainly." Frank's weathered face creased in thought. I've got some contacts still. I could make some calls, see what I can find out. After Frank left, Margaret found herself studying Max with new curiosity. What missions had he undertaken? What had he witnessed? And how had such a valuable military asset ended up trembling in a corner of the county animal shelter? The days fell into a rhythm. Each morning, Emma would wake early to work with Max in the backyard, teaching him to retrieve specific toys by name, practicing hand signals, and gradually introducing him to louder noises without triggering his anxiety. Margaret observed these sessions from the kitchen window, marveling at her granddaughter's patience and intuition. In the afternoons, they ventured further from home, first just to the front yard, then short walks around the block. Neighbors watched with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Some crossed to the opposite sidewalk, while others stopped to ask questions, drawn by the dignified bearing of the German shepherd and the evident bond between him and the small blonde girl. Eleanor Whitfield made a point of documenting these outings, clipboard in hand, as she noted times and behaviors from the vantage point of her front porch. Margaret acknowledged her with polite nods while silently cataloging the growing list of Max's positive behaviors to counter whatever violations Eleanor was recording. On Thursday evening, 5 days into their fostering, Margaret sat at the dining room table paying bills. The sight of her medication costs made her wince. The arthritis prescription alone consumed nearly a quarter of her monthly pension. She had already started cutting pills in half to stretch the supply, a strategy her doctor would certainly disapprove of. Emma entered the room, Max at her heels, and placed her notebook on the table. "I made something for you," she signed, her expression serious. Margaret opened the notebook to find a carefully drawn picture labeled, "Our Family." 3 figures stood hand in hand, a tall, gray-haired woman labeled Grandma, a small blonde girl with hearing aids labeled Me, and a German shepherd labeled Max. Above them, 2 cloud-like figures watched from the sky, labeled Mommy and Daddy. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, her throat tightening. Emma pointed to the drawing. "Max needs to stay," she signed firmly. "He's family now." Before Margaret could formulate a response, Max suddenly stiffened, his attention shifting to the window. A low, urgent growl rumbled in his throat as he moved toward the front door. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked, rising from her chair. Through the window she saw their elderly neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, collapsed on the sidewalk in front of their house. Margaret rushed outside, calling back to Emma to stay inside with Max. But as she reached Mr. Jenkins, she realized Max had followed, positioning himself protectively beside her as she knelt next to the fallen man. "Herbert, can you hear me?" Margaret took his pulse, finding it rapid and irregular. "Herbert, it's Margaret Wilson." Mr. Jenkins' eyes fluttered. "Chest. Hurts," he gasped. Margaret immediately recognized the signs of a heart attack. "Emma," she called. "Bring my phone, quickly." As Emma hurried out with the phone, Margaret instructed her to call 911, knowing the emergency operators would understand even her imperfect speech. Then she turned her attention back to Mr. Jenkins, loosening his collar and elevating his head slightly. "Help is coming, Herbert. Try to stay calm." Throughout the crisis, Max remained vigilant but calm, his presence a steady anchor for Emma, who watched the scene with wide eyes. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics worked efficiently around the German shepherd, who seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation and maintained a respectful distance while keeping Emma safely behind him. As they loaded Mr. Jenkins into the ambulance, one of the paramedics nodded toward Max. "That's some dog you got there, ma'am? Military trained?" "Yes," Margaret answered simply. The young man nodded with respect. "My brother works with them overseas. Best partners you could ask for in a crisis." Once the ambulance departed, Margaret noticed a small crowd had gathered, including Eleanor Whitfield, whose expression combined concern for Mr. Jenkins with evident surprise at Max's composed behavior during the emergency. That night, after Emma was asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and Max's fostering paperwork spread before her. The 3-day trial period had extended to 5, and the evaluation, Dr. Harrington had arranged, was still 3 days away. The rational decision would be to return Max to the shelter tomorrow, avoiding the complications of the HOA dispute and the emotional attachment that grew stronger each day. But rationality had little to do with the warmth she felt watching Emma speak aloud to Max, or the sense of security his presence provided in their previously empty house. The telephone rang, an unusual occurrence so late in the evening. Frank Patterson's voice greeted her when she answered. "Margaret, I found something about Max you need to know. Can I stop by tomorrow morning?" "Of course," she replied, eyeing the German shepherd who had lifted his head at the sound of his name. "Is it concerning?" Frank hesitated. "Let's just say his background is more significant than we thought. This isn't a dog that should have ended up in a county shelter. Someone wanted him to disappear." After hanging up, Margaret found herself studying Max with renewed curiosity. He returned her gaze steadily, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever his past held, whatever missions he had undertaken, he was here now, a guardian for Emma and, increasingly, for Margaret herself. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Emma had developed a routine of taking Max into the backyard first thing, letting him patrol the perimeter before settling into their training exercises. Margaret watched from the kitchen as her granddaughter demonstrated remarkable focus, working with Max on retrieving specific items and responding to various hand signals. When Emma came in for breakfast, her cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Max remembered all the commands today, even the hard ones." "That's wonderful," Margaret replied, setting a plate of toast before her. "Frank Patterson is coming over this morning. He has some information about Max." Emma's expression turned serious. "Good information or bad information?" "I'm not sure yet," Margaret admitted. "But Mr. Patterson is on our side, remember?" As if summoned by their conversation, the doorbell rang. Max, who had been lying calmly at Emma's feet, immediately assumed his alert posture, but showed none of the anxiety that had characterized his earlier days with them. Frank Patterson stood on the porch, holding a manila folder. "Morning, Margaret. Got those details I mentioned?" Over coffee at the kitchen table, Frank spread out several printed pages. "Called in some favors from old contacts," he explained. Max was part of a specialized tactical unit that trained dogs for complex operations, not just bomb detection or patrol. We're talking about dogs trained to assist in high-risk extractions, hostage situations, intelligence gathering. Margaret glanced at Emma, who was pretending to read a book while obviously eavesdropping. "That's unexpected." "Gets more interesting," Frank continued, lowering his voice. "According to my source, Max and his handler were involved in a classified operation that went bad about a year ago. Handler was killed. Max was injured but recovered physically. After that, he failed recertification due to trauma response." "PTSD," Margaret murmured, watching as Max rested his head on Emma's knee, the child absently stroking his ears while maintaining her pretense of reading. "Exactly. Military policy is to retire these dogs with their handlers or handlers' family when possible. But in this case—" Frank hesitated. "What happened?" Margaret prompted. "The official record shows Max was transferred to a rehabilitation program for service animals. But my contact says that program doesn't exist. It's a paper trail that leads nowhere." Frank's weathered face was grim. "Someone wanted this dog out of the system, Margaret. The question is why?" The implications hung in the air between them. Max wasn't just any traumatized military dog. He had been part of something significant, something possibly classified. And now he was in Margaret's living room, bonded to her 8-year-old granddaughter. "What should I do with this information?" Margaret asked quietly. Frank shrugged. "Nothing, necessarily, but be aware there might be more to Max's story than a simple case of PTSD. And if the right or wrong people realize where he is—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Margaret understood. The quiet life she had built for Emma and herself had just become potentially complicated in ways she couldn't have anticipated when she agreed to a 3-day fostering. After Frank left, Margaret found herself watching Max with new eyes. The German Shepherd was playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with Emma in the backyard, using his nose to locate toys she had hidden throughout the garden. His intelligence and training were evident in every movement, every response to Emma's commands. What had he seen? What did he know? And was it safe for him to be here? With them? As if sensing her scrutiny, Max paused in his play and looked directly at Margaret through the window. In that moment she saw not just a dog, but a survivor, like herself, like Emma. Whatever his past contained, he had found his way to them for a reason. That afternoon, Margaret took a significant step. She drove to the shelter with Emma and Max and formally changed their status from temporary foster to foster to adopt. Dr. Harrington, who happened to be on duty, smiled knowingly as he processed the paperwork. "I had a feeling," he said, watching Emma demonstrate to a delighted shelter volunteer how Max responded to her hand signals. "Some connections are just meant to be." "There are complications," Margaret said quietly. Frank Patterson discovered some concerning background about Max's military service. Dr. Harrington's expression remained carefully neutral. "Did he? Well, every dog has a history. The question is whether that history defines their future." On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her small hand resting on Max's fur. In the rearview mirror, Margaret could see the German Shepherd maintaining his vigilant posture despite the child's weight against him, his amber eyes scanning the passing traffic with military precision. "We're in this together now," Margaret told him softly. "Whatever comes next." That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she was startled by a sharp knock at the front door. Max immediately positioned himself between Emma and the potential threat, his posture alert but controlled. Margaret opened the door to find Eleanor Whitfield on her porch, clipboard in hand. But instead of her usual officious expression, Eleanor's face held something almost like contrition. "Margaret," she began stiffly, "I've come to acknowledge your dog's behavior yesterday during Herbert's medical emergency. It was exemplary." "Thank you," Margaret replied, surprised by this unexpected olive branch. "Would you like to come in?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded curtly. She entered the living room with evident trepidation, her eyes fixed on Max, who watched her with equal wariness. Several neighbors witnessed how the dog maintained order during the crisis, Eleanor continued, perching on the edge of the sofa. "And Herbert's wife called me from the hospital to specifically mention how your quick response and the dog's calm presence prevented a panic that might have worsened Herbert's condition." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to this visit than reluctant praise. "The HOA board has agreed to postpone our decision regarding the dog until after the professional evaluation on Monday." Eleanor's fingers tightened on her clipboard. "Provided there are no incidents before then." "That's very reasonable," Margaret said carefully. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Emma, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Max, her hearing aids glinting in the evening light. Something in the older woman's expression softened. "The dog seems good for her," she admitted. "She's speaking more." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "He's been transformative for Emma." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, filled with the weight of their 15-year neighborly friction and something deeper, something Margaret couldn't quite identify in Eleanor's carefully composed expression. "My son had a service dog," Eleanor said abruptly. "After his second tour, a German shepherd, like yours." Margaret stilled, sensing the significance of this revelation. "I didn't know your son served. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came back with severe PTSD. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the clipboard. "The dog helped for a while. But in the end, well, we lost them both." The simple statement contained volumes of grief. Margaret suddenly understood Eleanor's vehement opposition to Max. Not bureaucratic officiousness, but deeply personal fear. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor." Eleanor nodded stiffly, rising to her feet. "Just keep the dog controlled, Margaret. And I'll expect you both at the evaluation on Monday." After she left, Margaret stood at the window watching Eleanor's straight-backed figure retreat down the sidewalk. The woman's revelation had shifted something fundamental in Margaret's understanding of their long-standing antagonism. Emma tugged at Margaret's sleeve, her expression questioning. "Is Mrs. Whitfield still mad about Max?" she signed. "It's complicated, sweetheart," Margaret replied. "Sometimes people are afraid of things that remind them of sad memories." Emma nodded with the profound understanding of a child who had experienced her own devastating loss. "Like how you were afraid of Max at first because he reminded you of Grandpa's dog?" Margaret blinked, surprised by her granddaughter's perception. "Yes, exactly like that." "But you're not afraid anymore, right?" Emma pressed, her eyes serious. "Because you see that Max is Max, not Ranger." "When did you get so wise?" Margaret asked, smoothing Emma's blonde hair. The child shrugged. "Max taught me. He knows about sad memories too, but he still tries to be brave." That night, reviewing the day's events, Margaret realized their small family had crossed a threshold. Max was no longer a temporary visitor or even a foster. He had become essential, a bridge between past and present, between silence and sound. Whatever complications his mysterious background might bring, whatever obstacles Eleanor and the HOA might present, Margaret knew with certainty that she would fight to keep him, for Emma's sake and increasingly for her own. The weekend passed with an almost surreal normalcy. Margaret found herself settling into routines that now seamlessly incorporated Max. Morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoon training sessions in the backyard supervised by Emma, evening patrols where the German shepherd checked each door and window before settling into his bed. It was as if he had always been with them, filling spaces in their lives they hadn't recognized were empty. On Saturday morning, Frank Patterson arrived with a worn leather object tucked under his arm. "Found this in my attic," he explained, holding out what Margaret recognized as a specialized tactical vest for military dogs. "Thought it might help Max feel more purposeful." Margaret accepted the gift with mixed emotions. "Are you sure this is wise, given what you told me about his background?" Frank shrugged, his weathered face thoughtful. "A dog like Max was trained to have a mission. Sometimes the hardest part of retirement is losing that sense of purpose." He glanced toward the backyard where Emma was patiently teaching Max to differentiate between her stuffed animals. "Looks like he's found a new mission, but the familiar equipment might help bridge his past and present." When Emma saw the vest, her eyes widened. "Is this Max's uniform?" she asked, running her fingers over the specialized pockets and attachments. "Something like that," Margaret answered carefully. "Mr. Patterson thought Max might like to wear it sometimes, if it doesn't make him nervous." To their surprise, Max's reaction to the vest was immediate and positive. He stood perfectly still as Margaret fastened it around his broad chest, his posture transforming into an even more alert, dignified bearing. The change was remarkable, as if putting on the vest had reconnected him to his training and identity. "He remembers," Emma said with certainty, watching Max patrol the perimeter of the yard in his vest, moving with newfound confidence. "He knows who he is again." Margaret wasn't entirely comfortable with this militaristic side of Max, but she couldn't deny the positive effect it had on his demeanor. The nervous trembling that occasionally still afflicted him seemed to disappear entirely when he wore the vest. It was as if the physical reminder of his training helped him manage his trauma responses. Sunday morning found them at the local park, a bold expansion of their usual walking route. Max wore his vest, which prompted curious looks from other park-goers but also a respectful distance. Emma walked proudly beside him, occasionally signing commands that the German Shepherd followed with impressive precision. They were resting on a bench when Margaret noticed a man watching them with unusual intensity from across the playground. He was perhaps in his 50s, trim and military in his bearing, dressed in civilian clothes that nonetheless suggested a uniformed background. Max had noticed him too. The German Shepherd's posture subtly shifted, his attention fixed on the stranger with an alertness that wasn't quite alarm, but definitely indicated recognition of something, or someone, significant. "Emma, I think it's time to head home," Margaret said quietly, rising from the bench. As they turned to leave, the man approached, his path intersecting with theirs near the park entrance. Up close, Margaret could see the disciplined fitness of someone who had spent a lifetime in service, though his manner was carefully casual. "Beautiful dog," he commented, stopping a respectful distance away. "German Shepherd? Military trained?" Margaret tensed. "Yes, he's a retired service dog." The man nodded, his eyes never leaving Max. "I can tell by his bearing." "Special operations?" Before Margaret could formulate a suitably vague response, Emma stepped forward. "His name is Max," she said aloud, her speech more confident than Margaret had heard in months. "He was a hero, but now he's our family." The man's expression softened as he noticed Emma's hearing aids. "I see. Well, you've got yourself an exceptional guardian there, young lady." His gaze shifted back to Margaret, something unreadable in his eyes. "If you don't mind me asking, how did you come to adopt him?" "County shelter," Margaret replied, deliberately terse. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to be getting home." The man nodded, stepping aside. "Of course, enjoy your day." As they walked away, Margaret felt his eyes following them. Max remained unusually alert, his head turning occasionally to track the stranger until they were well beyond the park boundaries. "Did you know that man, Max?" Margaret asked quietly once they were safely on their own street. The German Shepherd made no response, but his continued vigilance spoke volumes. Something about the encounter had triggered his training, recognition perhaps, or a sense of potential threat. When they arrived home, Margaret was surprised to find Dr. Harrington's car in their driveway. The veterinarian was waiting on the porch, a leather briefcase beside him. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit," he said as they approached. "I thought it might be helpful to do a preliminary check before tomorrow's official evaluation." Margaret invited him in, grateful for his support, but also unsettled by the convergence of unusual events. Frank's revelations about Max's specialized background, the strange man at the park, and now Dr. Harrington's unexpected appearance. While Emma took Max into the backyard to remove his vest and get him water, Dr. Harrington spoke quietly to Margaret in the kitchen. "I've been doing some research of my own," he admitted. "Max's service record is largely classified, but I have contacts who filled in some gaps. He was part of an elite K-9 unit attached to Special Operations. His handler, a staff sergeant named David Mitchell, was killed during a mission last year." Margaret absorbed this confirmation of Frank's information. What happened to Max after that? Dr. Harrington's expression turned grim. That's where things get murky. He should have been evaluated for adoption by the handler's family or other military personnel. Instead, there's a paper transfer to a rehabilitation program that doesn't seem to exist. Then nothing until he appears at our shelter 6 months ago, brought in by a county animal control officer who found him wandering near the interstate. Someone wanted him to disappear, Margaret concluded, remembering Frank's words. It appears so. Dr. Harrington hesitated. Margaret, have you noticed anyone showing unusual interest in Max? Anyone asking questions or watching your house? The park encounter flashed through Margaret's mind. There was a man at the park today, military bearing, asking about Max. Dr. Harrington's expression sharpened. Did he identify himself? No, just commented on Max being military trained. Be careful, the veterinarian advised. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but a dog with Max's background, he may have been involved in sensitive operations, knowledge that could be valuable or dangerous, depending on who's looking for him. Margaret struggled to reconcile this spy novel scenario with their peaceful suburban life. He's a dog, James. What kind of knowledge could he possibly have? It's not about what Max knows, Dr. Harrington explained patiently. It's about what his presence might reveal. If certain operations were classified, having one of its participants suddenly appear in civilian life could be problematic for people who want those operations to remain secret. The implications settled like a weight on Margaret's shoulders. Are you saying we're in danger? Not necessarily, Dr. Harrington backtracked slightly. But awareness is prudent. Report any suspicious behavior, and perhaps reconsider having Max wear that tactical vest in public. It makes his military background rather obvious. After the veterinarian left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts in turmoil. Through the window she could see Emma and Max playing in the dappled shade of the oak tree, the child throwing a ball that the German shepherd retrieved with efficient precision. They looked so ordinary, so peaceful, a girl and her dog enjoying a summer afternoon. Yet beneath this tranquil surface lay currents of complexity Margaret hadn't anticipated when she'd reluctantly agreed to a 3-day fostering. Max wasn't just a retired military dog with PTSD. He was potentially a loose end from classified operations, sought by unknown parties for unknown reasons. The rational decision would be to return him to the shelter, to extract Emma and herself from whatever complicated situation they had inadvertently entered. But watching her granddaughter laugh as Max playfully nudged the ball back toward her, Margaret knew that option was no longer viable. The German shepherd had become essential to Emma's healing, a catalyst for her emergence from the silence that had enveloped her since the accident. And if Margaret were honest with herself, Max had become important to her as well. His dignified presence filled the empty spaces of their home, his protective vigilance allowing Margaret to sleep soundly for the first time in years. The thought of losing him, of explaining that loss to Emma, was unbearable. Whatever complications Max's past might bring, they would face them together. Monday morning dawned clear and warm, the Virginia summer asserting itself in earnest. Margaret woke early to find Max already at his post by the front window, his alert posture suggesting he had been there for some time, watching the quiet street as dawn broke over the neighborhood. "Anything interesting out there?" she asked softly, moving to stand beside him. Max glanced up at her, then returned his attention to the window. Something in his demeanor troubled Margaret, a tension that hadn't been present the previous evening. The official evaluation was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the community center. Eleanor had arranged for a specialized animal behaviorist to assess Max's temperament and training, with the HOA board present to witness the proceedings. The outcome would determine whether Max could remain with them permanently or would be deemed a threat to neighborhood safety. Margaret spent the morning coaching Emma on what to expect, emphasizing the importance of following the evaluator's instructions precisely. "Max needs to show his best behavior today," she explained as they ate breakfast. The evaluation will have some challenging elements to test how he responds to stress. Emma nodded seriously. He'll be good, Grandma. He wants to stay with us. At 9:30, they set out for the community center, Max walking calmly beside them. Margaret had decided against having him wear the tactical vest, heeding Dr. Harrington's advice about maintaining a lower profile. The community center parking lot was surprisingly full when they arrived. Margaret had expected the HOA board and the evaluator, but at least 20 neighbors had also gathered, forming distinct clusters that seemed to represent opposing viewpoints on the Max situation. Frank Patterson approached as they crossed the parking lot. "Quite the turnout," he commented, nodding toward the assembled neighbors. "Word spread about Herbert's heart attack and how Max helped maintain order. You've got more support than Eleanor anticipated." Inside, the community room had been arranged with chairs in a semicircle facing an open area presumably designated for Max's evaluation. Eleanor Whitfield stood near the front, clipboard in hand, conferring with a stern-looking woman in her 40s whose crisp pantsuit and no-nonsense demeanor marked her as the professional evaluator. Margaret and Emma took seats at the edge of the semicircle, Max sitting alertly between them. Dr. Harrington arrived moments later, nodding encouragingly as he took the seat beside Margaret. At precisely 10 o'clock, Eleanor called the meeting to order. "As you all know, we're here to evaluate the German Shepherd currently residing with Margaret and Emma Wilson to determine whether it poses a threat to community safety." She emphasized the word "it," deliberately depersonalizing Max in a way that made Margaret bristle. Miss Carla Johnson from Professional Canine Assessment will conduct the evaluation according to standardized protocols. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her expression neutral as she surveyed the assembled neighbors. "I'll be conducting a comprehensive assessment, including response to handling, reaction to sudden stimuli, behavior around strangers, and basic obedience. I'll need the dog's primary handler to assist." Emma stood immediately, her small figure determined despite the roomful of adults. "I'm his handler," she said, her voice clear enough that Margaret felt a surge of pride. Ms. Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly. "You—" "How old are you, young lady?" "8, Emma replied. "But Max listens to me best." There were murmurs from the assembled neighbors, some concerned, others amused. Ms. Johnson looked to Margaret for confirmation. "It's true," Margaret acknowledged. "They have a special connection. Emma's hearing impairment means she communicates primarily through sign language, and Max responds remarkably well to her hand signals." Miss Johnson considered this information, then nodded briskly. "Very well. We'll start with basic obedience. Please bring the dog to the center of the room." What followed was an impressive demonstration of the bond between Emma and Max. The German Shepherd responded flawlessly to her commands, both verbal and signed, executing sits, stays, recalls, and more complex behaviors with military precision. His focus remained entirely on Emma, his powerful body moving with controlled grace that belied his traumatic past. As the evaluation progressed to more challenging scenarios, sudden noises, approaching strangers, simulated aggression from a helper wearing protective gear, Max maintained his composed demeanor. He showed appropriate alertness without aggression, positioning himself protectively near Emma without becoming threatening. Even Eleanor looked impressed by the German Shepherd's performance, her rigid posture gradually relaxing as the evaluation continued without incident. "Final component," Miss Johnson announced after nearly an hour, "response to perceived threat to handler." She instructed Emma to stand in the center of the room, then had her assistant approach rapidly from behind, reaching for the child's shoulder. Before the man's hand made contact, Max moved with startling speed, placing himself between Emma and the approaching stranger. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply established a physical barrier, his posture communicating unmistakable warning. When the assistant backed away, Max immediately stood down, returning to Emma's side at her quiet command. "Textbook protective response," Ms. Johnson noted, making a final mark on her clipboard. "Proportionate, controlled, non-aggressive, but effective." She turned to address the assembled neighbors. "Based on my professional assessment, this dog displays exceptional training, appropriate protective instincts, and no signs of unpredictable aggression. His bond with the child is remarkable, possibly even therapeutic, given her communication challenges." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression conflicted. "So, your professional opinion is that the dog poses no threat to community safety?" "None whatsoever," Ms. Johnson confirmed. "In fact, I'd consider him an asset. Dogs with this level of training and temperament are rare outside professional service settings." A ripple of conversation spread through the room. Margaret felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, squeezing with excitement. Max remained at attention, seeming to understand that his performance was being evaluated. Eleanor cleared her throat. "The board will deliberate briefly before rendering a decision." As the HOA board members huddled at the front of the room, Dr. Harrington leaned toward Margaret. "Outstanding performance. I've never seen a better human-canine connection, especially with a child handler." "Emma's special," Margaret said simply, watching her granddaughter stroke Max's head with gentle appreciation. The board's deliberation was brief. Eleanor returned to the center of the room, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "The board has reached a unanimous decision," she announced, her voice carrying official weight despite the slight tremor Margaret detected beneath it. "Based on the professional evaluation and recent demonstration of civic value during Herbert Jenkins's medical emergency, the German Shepherd known as Max is approved for permanent residence within our community, contingent upon continued good behavior and proper restraint in public areas." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the assembled neighbors. Emma threw her arms around Max's neck, her face alight with joy. The German Shepherd endured this enthusiastic embrace with dignified patience, though Margaret noticed his eyes continued scanning the room, maintaining his protective vigilance even in this moment of victory. As people began to disperse, Eleanor approached Margaret, her expression softer than Margaret had seen it in years. "The dog has been good for Emma," she acknowledged. "I can admit when I've misjudged a situation." "Thank you, Eleanor," Margaret replied, recognizing the magnitude of this concession from her proud neighbor. "That means a great deal to us." Eleanor nodded stiffly, then hesitated. "One thing, Margaret. There was a man asking about your dog yesterday. Came by my house claiming to be from some veterans service organization, wanting to know details about him. Something felt off. I didn't tell him anything, but I thought you should know." A chill ran through Margaret despite the warm June day. "What did he look like?" "Military type, 50s, very fit, said all the right things, had the right credentials, but—" Eleanor shrugged. "When you've been on as many committees as I have, you develop a sense for when someone isn't being entirely forthright." "Thank you for the warning," Margaret said sincerely. As they left the community center, Margaret noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine running despite the heat. The windows were tinted, preventing her from seeing the occupants, but something about the vehicle's presence raised her internal alarms. Max had noticed it too. The German Shepherd's posture subtly shifted, his body angling slightly to place himself between Emma and the unknown vehicle. "Let's take the long way home," Margaret suggested, steering them toward a route that would wind through the neighborhood rather than following the direct path past the sedan. They had barely turned the corner when they heard the sound of a car engine accelerating behind them. Margaret glanced back to see the dark sedan approaching slowly, keeping pace with them from a distance. "Emma," she said quietly, "walk a little faster, please." Her granddaughter looked up questioningly but complied, her hand instinctively tightening on Max's leash. The German shepherd moved with them, his alert posture now unmistakably vigilant, ears tracking the sound of the following vehicle. Margaret's mind raced through options. Their house was still several blocks away. Frank Patterson lived closer, just 2 streets over. Making a split-second decision, she guided them toward a path between houses that would lead to Frank's street, a shortcut the car couldn't follow. "We're going to visit Mr. Patterson," she explained to Emma, keeping her voice deliberately calm despite the fear crawling up her spine. "I want to thank him for coming to support us today." As they cut between the Morrison and Tanner properties, Margaret heard the car accelerate, presumably to circle around and intercept them. Max's behavior confirmed her suspicions. The German shepherd was now in full protective mode, his body tight with controlled tension. They emerged onto Sycamore Lane just as Frank was retrieving his mail from the curbside box. He looked up in surprise as they approached, his expression shifting to concern as he registered their rapid pace and Max's alert posture. "Everything all right, Margaret?" he asked, eyes scanning past them toward the street they had exited. "I'm not sure," she admitted quietly as they reached him. "There's a car following us. Dark sedan, tinted windows." Frank's weathered face hardened. "Inside now," he directed, ushering them toward his front door. From the safety of Frank's living room, they watched as the dark sedan cruised slowly past the house, continuing down Sycamore Lane before turning at the next intersection. "Government plates," Frank noted grimly. "Unmarked, but official." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with Frank's air conditioning. "What do they want with Max?" Frank shook his head. "Could be legitimate. Checking on a valuable military asset that went missing. Could be something else." "Like what?" Margaret pressed. Frank's eyes met hers, decades of military intelligence experience evident in his measured response. "Like making sure certain operations stay buried with the men who carried them out." Emma, who had been sitting quietly with Max by the window, suddenly turned to them. "Someone's coming," she signed, pointing toward the street. A different vehicle had parked in front of Frank's house, a standard government SUV with official military police markings. 2 uniformed officers emerged, approaching the front door with purposeful strides. Max's reaction was immediate and concerning. He positioned himself in front of Emma, his posture rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "That's not good," Frank murmured, moving toward the door. "Military dogs are trained to respect MPs. If Max is reacting defensively—" The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime incongruous with the tension filling the room. Frank opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of his former rank. "Sir, we're here on official business regarding a military working dog believed to be in this area," one of the MPs stated formally. "We have information suggesting Margaret Wilson, resident of this neighborhood, has possession of this animal." Frank's posture straightened, years of military bearing reasserting themselves. "May I see your orders, please?" While the officers retrieved documentation from a portfolio, Margaret knelt beside Emma and Max. "Stay calm," she whispered to both of them. "Everything will be all right." But the tremor in her hand as she stroked Max's fur betrayed her uncertainty. After years of building a quiet life for Emma and herself, protected from the turmoil of the wider world, they had somehow stumbled into a situation beyond their control, all because they had opened their hearts to a traumatized German shepherd who needed a home. Frank examined the military police officer's documentation with the careful scrutiny of someone who had spent decades reviewing government paperwork. His weathered face revealed nothing as he studied the official orders, but Margaret noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "These appear to be in order," he finally acknowledged, handing the papers back. "However, I'd like to contact Colonel Matheson at the Pentagon to verify. I served under him in Army intelligence." The senior MP, his nameplate identified him as Sergeant Miller, hesitated. Sir, our orders are to secure the animal immediately and transport it to Fort Belvoir for assessment. And you'll do that, Frank assured him, after we verify the authorization, a courtesy between military professionals. Margaret watched this exchange from the living room, one hand on Emma's shoulder, the other resting on Max's head. The German shepherd remained unnaturally still beside them, his amber eyes fixed on the doorway, body radiating tension. "What's happening?" Emma signed, her small face confused and frightened. "These men say Max belongs to the military," Margaret explained quietly, choosing honesty over false reassurances. "They want to take him back." Emma's expression crumpled. "No, they can't. He's ours now." Her outburst carried to the doorway, drawing the attention of the officers. The younger MP's expression softened slightly at the sight of the small girl with hearing aids clinging to the German shepherd. "Ma'am," Sergeant Miller addressed Margaret, "I understand this is upsetting, but this animal is classified as military property. His disappearance has been under investigation for several months." "His name is Max," Emma said aloud, her voice trembling but determined. "And he's not property. He's family." Frank had moved to his landline telephone and was dialing with deliberate precision. "I'll have this sorted in a few minutes," he told the officers, his tone suggesting they had little choice but to wait. Margaret used this brief reprieve to gather her thoughts. "May I ask what will happen to Max if you take him?" The younger officer glanced at his superior before answering. "Ma'am, that would depend on the assessment. Military working dogs that can be rehabilitated are typically reassigned or approved for civilian adoption through official channels. And if they can't be rehabilitated?" Margaret pressed. The officer's silence was answer enough. "He has been rehabilitated," Margaret insisted, gesturing toward Max's calm demeanor despite the obvious stress of the situation. "He just passed a professional evaluation this morning. He's bonded with my granddaughter who has special needs. Taking him now would be traumatic for both of them." Sergeant Miller's expression remained impassive. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but my orders are specific. This particular animal was involved in classified operations. His training and conditioning make him a specialized asset." Frank completed his call and returned to the door, his bearing subtly more confident. "Colonel Matheson is verifying the orders now. He's requested we stand by for approximately 30 minutes. The officers exchanged glances. Protocol dictated they wait for verification when challenged by a retired officer of Frank's standing, but their reluctance was palpable. 30 minutes, Sergeant Miller agreed curtly. "Then we will execute our orders regardless of verification status." As the officers returned to their vehicle to wait, Frank closed the door and turned to Margaret with grave concern. "Those orders are genuine, but something's not right." "Matheson is checking the authorization chain." "Can they really just take him?" Margaret asked, her voice low to avoid alarming Emma further. Frank's expression was grim. "Technically, yes. Military working dogs were classified as equipment until very recently. There's legislation protecting them now, but if Max was involved in classified operations," he shook his head, "the rules get murky." "What can we do?" Margaret whispered, watching as Emma stroked Max's fur with trembling fingers, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. "Hope Matheson finds something irregular in the authorization," Frank replied. "Otherwise, our options are limited. Refusing to comply with military police would have serious consequences." The 30 minutes that followed were among the longest of Margaret's life. Emma refused to leave Max's side, alternating between silent tears and fierce whispered promises that she wouldn't let anyone take him. The German shepherd remained unnaturally still, pressed against Emma's side, his eyes constantly moving between the door and windows as if expecting threats from multiple directions. Margaret's mind raced through scenarios, each more desperate than the last. Could they refuse to surrender Max? Run? Hide him somewhere? Each option seemed more impossible than the last, and none addressed the fundamental issue. If the military wanted their dog back, they had the legal authority to take him. Frank paced near the window, occasionally checking his watch. 28 minutes, he muttered. Matheson should have called back by now. As if summoned by his words, the telephone rang. Frank answered, his expression intense as he listened to the voice on the other end. Margaret watched anxiously, trying to interpret his terse responses. "I see," Frank said finally. "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate your assistance." He hung up and turned to Margaret, his face grave. "Matheson says the orders are technically valid but irregular. They originated from an unusual channel. Not the standard military working dog program, but a specialized division with limited oversight." "What does that mean for Max?" Margaret asked. "It means someone with significant authority wants him back, and they're using official channels to do it." Frank's weathered face showed rare uncertainty. "Matheson advised compliance to avoid escalation, but he's making calls to get more information." The doorbell rang again, signaling the officer's return. Frank opened the door to find Sergeant Miller standing rigidly at attention. "Sir, our 30 minutes have elapsed. We need to take possession of the animal now." Frank nodded reluctantly. "I understand. Please allow the family a moment to say goodbye." Margaret felt a cold numbness spreading through her chest as she knelt beside Emma. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "the officers need to take Max now." It's the law." Emma's face contorted with grief and incomprehension. "No! They can't! He belongs with us!" She threw her arms around Max's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Please, Grandma, don't let them take him." The raw desperation in her granddaughter's voice tore at Margaret's heart. For 3 years, she had watched Emma retreat further into silence after losing her parents, helpless to reach her through the barriers of grief and trauma. Max had accomplished in days what therapists and specialists hadn't managed in years, drawing Emma back into the world, restoring her voice and confidence. And now they were about to lose him. "Mrs. Wilson," Sergeant Miller called from the doorway, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to proceed now." Margaret gently disentangled Emma's arms from around Max. "We have to obey the officers, sweetheart. But this isn't the end. We'll find a way to get Max back, I promise." Emma's face crumpled. "You promised we could keep him forever. You promised." The accusation cut deep, but Margaret maintained her composure. "I'm going to fight for him, Emma. We both will. But right now, we have to let him go with these officers." Max seemed to understand what was happening. The German shepherd nuzzled Emma's tear-streaked face, then turned and pressed his muzzle briefly against Margaret's hand, a gesture of such profound understanding that her composure nearly cracked. "You'll need his leash," Margaret said, her voice strained as she retrieved it from beside the door. "And he responds best to hand signals. He has trauma responses to loud noises and sudden movements." Sergeant Miller nodded, accepting the information with professional courtesy. "We'll handle him appropriately, ma'am. Our K-9 handlers are well trained." The younger officer stepped forward with a specialized tactical leash. As he reached for Max's collar, the German shepherd went rigid, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. "Max, no," Margaret said sharply. "It's okay." To everyone's surprise, Emma straightened and made a specific hand gesture, one of the military commands she somehow knew. Max immediately stood down, though his body remained tense. "He understands hand signals," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "He gets scared with strangers." The officer nodded gratefully, attaching the leash with slow, deliberate movements. "Thank you for telling me. We'll be careful with him." As they led Max toward the door, Emma made one final, desperate plea. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please don't hurt him. He's already been hurt too much." Something in her words, or perhaps in the sight of a small, hearing-impaired child pleading for her dog, caused both officers to pause. Sergeant Miller knelt to Emma's level, his official demeanor softening slightly. "Young lady, I promise we'll treat him with respect. Military working dogs are valued members of our forces." Emma's tears flowed freely now. "He saved me," she whispered. "Now I can't save him." The officer had no response to this. He rose and gestured to his subordinate to proceed. As they led Max out the door, the German shepherd looked back once, his amber eyes meeting Emma's in a gaze of such profound connection that Margaret had to look away, unable to bear witness to this severing. The moment the door closed behind them, Emma collapsed into gut-wrenching sobs. Margaret gathered her into her arms, her own tears falling silently as she held her granddaughter's shaking body. "We'll get him back," she whispered fiercely. "I promise you, Emma. This isn't over." Frank watched through the window as the officers loaded Max into a specialized compartment in their vehicle. "They're being careful with him," he reported quietly. Professional handling. Small comfort, Margaret thought, as Emma's sobs gradually subsided into a hollow silence that was somehow worse. The child who had finally found her voice through her connection with Max seemed to be retreating before their eyes, shutting down in response to this fresh trauma. They returned home an hour later after Emma had cried herself into exhausted sleep on Frank's couch. Margaret carried her granddaughter into the silent house, placing her gently on her bed without disturbing her. The absence of Max's greeting, his customary patrol of the perimeter, his alert presence at the door, was a palpable void. In the living room, Margaret sank onto the sofa, emotionally and physically drained. Max's bed sat empty in the corner, his water bowl untouched in the kitchen. Just that morning they had celebrated his official acceptance into the neighborhood. Now he was gone, taken by authorities whose motives remained unclear. The telephone rang, startling her from her grief. Dr. Harrington's concerned voice greeted her. "Margaret, I just heard what happened. Frank called me. I'm so sorry." "They just took him," Margaret said, her voice hollow, "like he was equipment. After everything he's been through, after how far he's come with Emma." "I've made some calls," Dr. Harrington said, a new urgency in his tone. "There's something you need to know about Max. His handler, Staff Sergeant Mitchell, the man who died during their last mission. He had family, a sister who's been searching for Max since her brother's death." Margaret straightened, a flicker of hope kindling. "The military told her he was sent to a rehabilitation program that doesn't exist." "Exactly," Dr. Harrington confirmed. "She's been fighting the system for months trying to find him. Military regulations give family members of deceased handlers priority for adoption. So she could claim him legally," Margaret realized, her mind racing. "But how does that help us now? We don't know where they've taken him or what they plan to do with him." "The sister's name is Rebecca Mitchell," Dr. Harrington continued. "She's a civilian attorney specializing in military law. I've contacted her, explained the situation. She's driving down from D.C. tonight to meet with you tomorrow morning." For the first time since the MPs had led Max away, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Does she have the legal authority to demand his return? "It's complicated," Dr. Harrington admitted, "but she has rights the military can't easily dismiss, especially with recent legislation protecting military working dogs. And she has resources we don't: connections, legal expertise, insider knowledge of the system." After hanging up, Margaret sat in the quiet house processing this unexpected development. Max had been taken from them, but perhaps this wasn't the end. If his handler's sister had legal rights to him, and if she was willing to help them, Her thoughts were interrupted by a small sound from the hallway. Emma stood there in her rumpled clothes, her face pale and tear-stained, her hearing aids clutched in her hand rather than worn. "Is Max coming back?" she asked, her voice flat and empty. Margaret hesitated, torn between false comfort and harsh reality. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to fight for him. Doctor Harrington found someone who might be able to help us, Max's first handler's sister. She's coming tomorrow to talk with us." Emma nodded, but the spark of hope Margaret had expected didn't materialize. Instead, the child turned and walked silently back to her room, closing the door with quiet finality. That night, Margaret was awakened by muffled sounds from Emma's room. She found her granddaughter huddled on the floor beside her bed, clutching Max's favorite toy, a stuffed duck he had carried gently rather than destroyed, contrary to typical dog behavior. "I can't sleep," Emma signed, not looking up. "The house feels wrong without him." Margaret sat beside her on the floor, wrapping an arm around Emma's thin shoulders. "I know, sweetheart. I feel it too." "What if they hurt him?" Emma whispered. "What if he thinks we abandoned him?" The questions pierced Margaret's heart. "Max is smart," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "He knows we didn't want him to go. And Dr. Harrington says the military values their dogs." Emma looked up, her blue eyes swimming with tears. "But they left him at the shelter before. They threw him away like garbage." Margaret had no answer for this stark truth. Instead, she held Emma until the child finally drifted into restless sleep, then carried her back to bed. Returning to her own room, Margaret found herself standing before the closet where she kept John's personal effects. With determined movements, she retrieved the box containing his canine unit materials, the documentation, training manuals, and photographs she had avoided for 15 years. At the kitchen table, surrounded by the memories of her late husband's career with police dogs, Margaret began to educate herself. If they were going to fight for Max, she needed to understand the systems and regulations governing military working dogs. She needed to become an expert overnight. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, Margaret was still at the table, surrounded by printed research from her rarely used computer and John's old materials. She had constructed a timeline of Max's service, compiled a list of relevant military regulations, and drafted a formal appeal to the base commander at Fort Belvoir, where she believed Max had been taken. The doorbell rang at precisely 8 o'clock. Margaret opened it to find a woman in her early 30s standing on the porch. She was slender but athletic, with the same military bearing Margaret had observed in the MPs, though she wore civilian clothes, a tailored blazer over dark jeans. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes, a striking amber remarkably similar to Max's, were sharp with intelligence and determination. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Rebecca Mitchell, Staff Sergeant David Mitchell's sister." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "I understand you've been caring for my brother's dog." Margaret invited her in, noting the woman's quick, assessing glance around the living room, taking in Max's bed in the corner, the water bowl in the kitchen, the photographs of Emma and Max already displayed on the mantel. "He was well loved here," Rebecca observed quietly. "He still is," Margaret corrected. "We're not giving up on him." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Dr. Harrington explained how Max has helped your granddaughter. I want you to know that was exactly what David would have wanted for him, to continue serving, to help someone heal." Before they could continue, Emma appeared in the hallway. She had dressed herself carefully in the blue dress she had worn to the shelter on the day they met Max, her hearing aids in place, her expression solemn beyond her years. "Are you Max's first mom?" she asked Rebecca directly. Rebecca blinked, momentarily taken aback by the child's directness. "In a way," she acknowledged. "My brother was his handler, the person who trained him and worked with him. When my brother died, I tried to find Max to bring him home, but the military told me he had been sent to a special facility. I've been searching for him ever since." Emma approached, studying Rebecca with intense scrutiny. "Max misses him," she said with the simple certainty of a child. "Sometimes he whines in his sleep and looks for someone who isn't there." Rebecca's composed expression faltered, genuine emotion breaking through her professional demeanor. "David loved that dog more than anything," she said softly. "They were inseparable for 3 years. Max saved me," Emma continued, her small face serious. "I didn't talk much after my parents died, but Max understood me anyway. He made me not feel so alone." Rebecca knelt to Emma's level, meeting her gaze directly. Then Max was doing exactly what David would have wanted. "My brother believed service didn't end when the uniform came off." For the first time since Max had been taken, Margaret saw a flicker of hope in Emma's eyes. "Are you going to help us get him back?" Rebecca glanced up at Margaret, then back to Emma. "I'm going to try," she promised. "I have legal rights as David's next of kin, and I have friends in the military working dog program, but I need to understand exactly what happened yesterday, who took Max, and what authorization they presented." Over the next hour, Margaret and Frank, who arrived shortly after Rebecca, recounted the previous day's events in detail. Rebecca took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points: the officers' unit designations, the exact wording of their orders, Max's behavior during the encounter. "So, these weren't regular K-9 unit officers," she summarized, frowning at her notes. "And their orders originated outside the standard military working dog program." "That's what Colonel Matheson told me," Frank confirmed. "He said the authorization was valid, but irregular." Rebecca's frown deepened. "That matches what I've encountered in my search for Max these past months. Every time I thought I was getting close, the trail would disappear into classified channels." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "Why would Max's whereabouts be classified?" Rebecca hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "My brother's last mission was special operations. The details are classified, but I know it involved high-value intelligence. I've suspected for months that whatever happened on that mission is connected to Max's disappearance." "You think someone is trying to cover something up?" Frank stated flatly, his intelligence background allowing him to read between the lines. "I think," Rebecca said deliberately, "that a military working dog with Max's training would have been present for everything that happened during that mission. He would have seen things, been present for conversations. If someone wanted to ensure certain details never came to light." She didn't need to finish the thought. The implications hung in the air, disturbing and profound. Max wasn't just a dog with PTSD. He was potentially a witness to classified operations that someone wanted buried. Emma, who had been listening intently despite the complex subject matter, suddenly spoke up. "Is Max in danger?" The adults exchanged uncomfortable glances, none wanting to frighten the child further, but all recognizing the gravity of the situation. "I don't think anyone would harm a military working dog," Rebecca finally answered, choosing her words with care. "That would raise too many questions." "But they might ensure he remains in military custody indefinitely, classified as unsuitable for civilian adoption due to his training or behavior." "But that's not fair," Emma protested. "Max is good. He passed his test yesterday." "No, it's not fair," Rebecca agreed, "which is why we're going to fight for him, today." She outlined her plan. They would drive to Fort Belvoir immediately, where she would present her formal request for Max's release to her custody as next of kin to his handler. She had supporting documentation, her brother's will specifically mentioning his wish for Max to live with Rebecca in the event of his death, military regulations regarding retired working dogs, and the recent National Defense Authorization Act that included provisions for military working dogs to be returned to their handlers or handlers' families. "What can we do to help?" Margaret asked, already reaching for her purse. Rebecca considered the question. Emma's connection with Max could be crucial. If there's a behavioral evaluation, her presence could demonstrate his rehabilitation and suitability for civilian life. Margaret hesitated, weighing the trauma of potentially another disappointment against the chance of helping recover Max. It might be difficult for her emotionally. "I want to go," Emma insisted, her expression determined beyond her years. "Max needs me." As they prepared to leave, Margaret found herself filled with conflicting emotions: hope that Rebecca's legal expertise might secure Max's return, fear that the mysterious forces that had taken him might prove too powerful to counter, and a steely determination that had been dormant since her days as a combat nurse. Whatever happened, she would not allow Emma to suffer another loss without fighting with every resource at her disposal. The drive to Fort Belvoir took just over an hour, during which Rebecca briefed them on military protocol and what to expect at the base. Emma sat silently in the back seat, clutching Max's stuffed duck, her expression solemn but composed. As they approached the military base, its imposing gates and uniformed guards a stark reminder of the power they were challenging, Margaret reached back and squeezed Emma's hand. "Remember what I promised you," she said softly. "This isn't over." Emma nodded, her small fingers returning the pressure with surprising strength. "We're Max's pack now," she replied with simple certainty. "And pack never gives up." Fort Belvoir's military working dog facility stood apart from the main complex, a utilitarian building surrounded by training yards and obstacle courses. As Rebecca led Margaret and Emma through security checkpoints, her military ID and legal credentials opening doors that would have remained firmly closed to them otherwise, Margaret was struck by the clinical efficiency of the environment. This was a place where dogs were assets, not companions, valued for their capabilities rather than their hearts. Emma walked between them, her small hand gripping Margaret's tightly, her gaze taking in everything with the heightened observation skills of a child who relied partly on visual cues to navigate the world. She hadn't spoken since they'd passed through the main gate, but her posture radiated the same determination Margaret had seen in her during Max's evaluation at the community center. "The K-9 commanding officer is expecting us," Rebecca explained as they approached the main building. "Captain Daniels is an old friend from when David was in training. He's sympathetic to our case, but he may be limited in what he can do depending on who authorized Max's retrieval." Inside, they were escorted to a small conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and dog. Captain Daniels, a compact man in his 40s with a weathered face and direct gaze, greeted Rebecca with a brief hug before extending his hand to Margaret. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry about the circumstances. I understand this has been difficult for your family." Margaret appreciated his straightforward acknowledgement. "Thank you, Captain. We just want to understand what's happening with Max and hopefully bring him home." Captain Daniels gestured for them to sit, his expression carefully neutral. "I've reviewed the situation since Rebecca contacted me last night. I want to be transparent with you. This is complicated. The team that brought Max in yesterday wasn't from our standard MWD program. They were operating under special authorization from a division I rarely interact with." "Intelligence?" Rebecca asked, her tone suggesting she'd already guessed the answer. Captain Daniels nodded slightly. "Max is currently being held in our medical evaluation kennel, not our general population. I'm told he's undergoing assessment, though I haven't been given details about what that entails." Emma, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Is he scared?" The captain's professional demeanor softened as he addressed the child. "Military working dogs are very resilient, young lady. Max has excellent training that helps him handle stressful situations." "He gets tremors when he's afraid," Emma persisted. "And he hides in small spaces during thunderstorms." Captain Daniels looked momentarily surprised by this specific knowledge. "I'll make sure the handlers know that. It could help them make him more comfortable." Rebecca placed a folder on the table. "I've brought documentation establishing my legal right to claim Max as David's next of kin. The Robbie's Law provision and the 2016 NDAA amendments clearly state that military working dogs should be made available for adoption first to their handlers or handlers' families." "Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right," Captain Daniels acknowledged. "But there's a national security exception clause that's being invoked in this case." "On what grounds?" Rebecca demanded, her professional composure slipping slightly. The captain hesitated, glancing at Emma. Margaret understood his reluctance to discuss classified matters in front of a child. "Emma," she said gently, "would you like to draw a picture for Max while we talk? Maybe something to show him when we see him?" To Margaret's relief, Emma nodded and accepted the small notepad and pen Captain Daniels provided. With her granddaughter engrossed in her drawing, Margaret turned back to the conversation. "What national security concerns could possibly apply to a retired military dog with PTSD?" she asked quietly. Captain Daniels leaned forward, his voice lowered. "The official position is that Max's specialized training makes him a security risk in civilian hands. The realistic concern is about what he witnessed during his last mission with Staff Sergeant Mitchell." "He's a dog," Margaret pointed out. "He can't exactly testify about what he saw." "No," Rebecca interjected, her legal mind connecting dots, "but his existence proves David was there. If someone is trying to deny certain operations took place—" Captain Daniels neither confirmed nor denied this theory, but his expression spoke volumes. "What I can tell you is that Major Thomas Garrett is overseeing Max's assessment. He's scheduled to meet with us in about 15 minutes. "Garrett?" Rebecca's head snapped up. "He was David's commanding officer on that last mission." "The same," Captain Daniels confirmed. "He specifically requested oversight when Max was located." Margaret felt a chill at this information. The mysterious threads surrounding Max's appearance at the shelter and subsequent reclamation were beginning to weave into a concerning pattern. Whatever had happened on that final mission, someone with significant authority wanted to ensure it remained buried, even if that meant keeping a traumatized military dog in permanent custody. As they waited for Major Garrett's arrival, Emma continued drawing, her small face intent on her work. Margaret caught glimpses of what appeared to be Max in various scenes: Max at their house, Max in the backyard, Max sleeping beside Emma's bed during thunderstorms. "He saved me," Emma said suddenly, looking up from her drawing to address Captain Daniels directly. "Not like in war, but he saved me anyway." The captain's professional reserve faltered. "How did he save you, young lady?" "I was stuck in the quiet place after my parents died," Emma explained, her hands moving in unconscious signs as she spoke. "Doctors tried to help me talk again, but I couldn't. Then Max came, and he understood me without words. He made the world feel safe again." The simple testimony, delivered in a child's halting speech, landed with profound impact. Captain Daniels cleared his throat, visibly moved. "That's what these dogs do," he said quietly. "They bridge gaps others can't." The door opened, and Major Thomas Garrett entered the room with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to command. He was tall and lean, his uniform immaculate, his gray hair cropped short in a regulation cut that emphasized the hard angles of his face. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept the room, lingering briefly on Rebecca before settling on Margaret and Emma with calculated interest. Ms. Mitchell, he acknowledged Rebecca with a curt nod. I was informed of your petition regarding military working dog designation MWD T7249, formerly partnered with Staff Sergeant David Mitchell. His name is Max, Emma interrupted, seemingly unintimidated by the Major's imposing presence. Not a number. Major Garrett's expression remained impassive as he regarded the child. Young lady, military working dogs receive designations for official purposes, just as soldiers have service numbers along with their names. Captain Daniels performed introductions, explaining Margaret and Emma's connection to Max. Throughout, Major Garrett maintained a rigidly professional demeanor, though Margaret, with her nurse's trained observation skills, noticed the slight tension in his jaw when Emma was described as having formed a significant bond with Max. I appreciate your attachment to this animal, Major Garrett stated once formalities were complete. However, MWD T7249 remains military property, categorized as a specialized asset with training that makes civilian placement problematic. My assessment team has already noted significant security protocol responses that confirm this classification. What does that mean? Margaret asked, struggling to parse the military jargon. It means, Rebecca translated, her tone carefully controlled, that Max is still responding to specialized commands and training that the military considers sensitive. Major Garrett nodded. Precisely. This animal's continued access to certain operational triggers makes him unsuitable for civilian placement. That's not accurate, Margaret countered, surprising herself with her boldness. Max has been living peacefully in our home for over a week. He passed a professional behavioral evaluation just yesterday morning with perfect scores. Civilian evaluations cannot adequately assess military conditioning, Major Garrett dismissed. Our specialists have documented multiple protocol responses that indicate persistent specialized training. Emma had been watching this exchange with growing distress. Now she looked directly at Major Garrett, her blue eyes fierce with conviction. Max knows how to be both, she stated firmly. He can be a military dog when he needs to protect us, and a family dog when we're safe. He's smart enough for both. Something flickered across Major Garrett's face. Surprise, perhaps, at being so directly challenged by a child, or recognition of the truth in her words. Rebecca seized the moment. Major, I'd like to formally request a demonstration evaluation with Emma present. If you're assessing Max's responses to specialized triggers, it's only fair to also evaluate his civilian adaptation, which these civilian witnesses can attest to. Captain Daniels nodded thoughtfully. That's not an unreasonable request, sir. A comprehensive evaluation would include observation of the dog's behavior with individuals he's bonded with. Major Garrett's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Protocol dictates that civilian access to MWDs under security evaluation is restricted. Then consider it part of the evaluation, Rebecca pressed. If Max truly retains sensitive operational conditioning that makes him unsuitable for civilian placement, surely that would be evident even in the presence of individuals he's bonded with. The logic was impeccable, leaving Major Garrett little room to object without appearing obstructionist. After a calculated pause, he nodded curtly. A brief, supervised interaction may be permitted as part of the overall assessment. Captain Daniels will escort you to the evaluation area. As Major Garrett left to make arrangements, Rebecca turned to Margaret with a quick, tight smile. Small victory, she murmured. But it gets us access to Max, which is the first step. Captain Daniels led them through a series of corridors to a large indoor training area. Through a window, Margaret could see Max in an adjacent room, lying alertly on a mat, while a uniformed handler stood nearby. The German shepherd appeared physically unharmed, but held himself with the rigid tension she recognized from his first days at their home. Emma pressed against the window, her small hands splayed on the glass. "Max!" she called, though the room was soundproofed. As if sensing her presence, Max's head came up, ears pivoting forward. He rose to his feet, gaze searching until it locked on Emma's figure at the window. His entire demeanor transformed, the military rigidity melting into the more fluid posture Margaret had come to associate with his relaxed state at home. "He recognizes her," Captain Daniels observed, genuine interest in his voice. Even through the glass, Major Garrett returned with 2 additional officers who were introduced as behavioral specialists. After a brief explanation of the evaluation parameters, Emma would be allowed 15 minutes of supervised interaction with Max to demonstrate their bond. They were escorted into the evaluation room. The handler currently with Max stepped aside, maintaining control of the leash but allowing enough slack for the German Shepherd to approach Emma. What followed brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Max, who had been maintaining strict military bearing, transformed at the sight of the small girl. His tail wagged with restrained joy, his body language softening as Emma knelt before him. "Hi, Max," she said softly, her hands moving in the signs they had developed together. "I missed you so much." Max whined softly, pressing his muzzle gently against her outstretched hand. The connection between them was palpable, a communication that transcended conventional understanding. "May I show you what he can do?" Emma asked the assembled officers, her voice stronger than Margaret had heard it in days. With permission granted, Emma began demonstrating the communication system she and Max had developed. A combination of standard signs, verbal cues, and unique gestures that the German Shepherd responded to with impressive precision. She showed how he could differentiate between multiple toys by name, how he alerted to her emotional states, how he positioned himself protectively when strangers approached, but stood down immediately at her command. Throughout the demonstration, the behavioral specialists took notes, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested professional surprise. Even Major Garrett, observing from near the door, couldn't entirely mask his reaction to the extraordinary bond on display. "Now I'll show you his special skills," Emma announced, with the confidence of a seasoned trainer. "Max knows how to be brave during scary things." Before anyone could intervene, she deliberately dropped a metal clipboard that had been left on a nearby table. The loud clatter echoed through the room, precisely the kind of sudden noise that had triggered Max's PTSD responses in the shelter. Max startled but didn't retreat. Instead, he looked immediately to Emma, who signed a reassurance. The German Shepherd visibly calmed, maintaining his position beside her despite his initial fear response. "See," Emma said proudly. "He used to hide when things were loud. Now he checks with me first. We help each other be brave." The simplicity and profundity of this statement landed heavily in the evaluation room. Margaret saw Captain Daniels and one of the specialists exchange meaningful glances. "That's remarkable progress for a dog with documented PTSD," one specialist commented. "The bond is clearly therapeutic for both the animal and the child." Major Garrett's expression remained impassive, but Margaret noticed a subtle tension in his stance. The animal's responses to specific operational triggers are the primary concern, not its civilian adaptation. "With respect, sir," the same specialist countered, "rehabilitation potential is a standard component of MWD evaluation for potential discharge. This demonstration shows exceptional progress." As the officers discussed Max's performance in clinical terms, Emma continued her quiet interaction with the German Shepherd, seemingly oblivious to the debate determining his fate. She showed him her drawing, speaking softly about how empty the house felt without him, promising they were trying to bring him home. Max listened with the focused attention Margaret had observed countless times at home. His amber eyes fixed on Emma's face, his ears moving slightly to catch each word despite her sometimes imperfect pronunciation. When the 15 minutes elapsed, Major Garrett stepped forward. "That will be sufficient for evaluation purposes. "Handler, please secure the animal." As the handler moved to take Max's leash, Emma made a small, distressed sound. Max immediately positioned himself protectively beside her, not aggressive but clearly communicating his intention to remain with his young charge. "It's okay, Max," Emma whispered, though tears streamed down her face. "You have to stay here a little longer, but we're coming back for you. I promise." She made a specific hand gesture, one Margaret recognized as a stand down command, and Max reluctantly allowed the handler to lead him away. Just before exiting, the German Shepherd looked back once, his gaze connecting with Emma's in a moment of such profound understanding that several of the observing officers visibly reacted. Once Max had been removed, Major Garrett addressed them with clinical detachment. "The evaluation team will compile their observations and submit recommendations. However, I must emphasize that final disposition remains at my discretion due to the specialized nature of this animal's training and deployment history." Rebecca stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise tone. "Major, I've submitted comprehensive documentation establishing my legal right to custody of Max as Staff Sergeant Mitchell's designated next of kin. The 2016 NDAA explicitly prioritizes handler families for adoption of military working dogs." "I'm familiar with the legislation, Ms. Mitchell," Major Garrett replied coolly. "I'm also familiar with the national security exceptions applicable in this case. This particular animal possesses specialized training that presents ongoing security concerns." "What concerns specifically?" Rebecca pressed. After 8 months separated from his military handlers, any time-sensitive intelligence value would be long expired. Something hardened in Major Garrett's expression, a fleeting glimpse of the steel beneath his professional veneer. That assessment would depend on the nature of the intelligence and operations involved, which remain classified. The underlying message was clear. The concerns about Max weren't really about his training or capabilities, but about what he represented, a living connection to a classified operation that someone wanted to remain buried. As they were escorted back to the conference room to await the evaluation team's preliminary findings, Margaret noticed Emma's growing withdrawal. The child who had demonstrated such remarkable composure during Max's evaluation was retreating into herself again, her hands moving in small, unconscious signs against her lap. "You did wonderfully, sweetheart," Margaret reassured her, smoothing Emma's blonde hair. "You showed them how special Max is, how much he's improved with us." Emma looked up, her blue eyes swimming with tears. "Major Garrett doesn't want Max to come home. I can tell." The simple, accurate assessment of the situation pierced Margaret's heart. How could she explain the complex adult world of classified operations, professional reputations, and institutional self-protection to an 8-year-old who simply wanted her dog back? "Sometimes," she said carefully, "grown-ups make decisions based on rules and concerns that don't always make sense to others." But Rebecca is fighting for Max using different rules, legal ones that might be stronger. Emma considered this, then asked with devastating directness, "Is it because of what happened to Max's first person? The thing no one's supposed to know about?" Margaret exchanged a startled glance with Rebecca. The child's perception was uncanny. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Rebecca inquired gently. Emma's fingers traced patterns on the table, the same patterns Margaret had seen her use with Max. "Max has bad dreams about it, and he gets scared when he hears certain words or sees certain things, like his person is trying to tell him something important, but he can't say it with words." The hair on Margaret's arms rose. Before either adult could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, Captain Daniels returned with one of the behavioral specialists. "The evaluation team has completed their preliminary assessment," he announced, his neutral tone giving nothing away. They've documented both the specialized response patterns that triggered the security concerns and the exceptional civilian adaptation demonstrated during Emma's interaction. "And their recommendation?" Rebecca prompted. Captain Daniels glanced briefly at his colleague before answering. "The team has recommended conditional release to civilian custody, with specific handling protocols and regular check-ins to monitor continued adaptation." A surge of hope rose in Margaret's chest, immediately tempered by Captain Daniels' next words. "However, Major Garrett has indicated he requires additional time to review the security implications. He's scheduled a final determination meeting for tomorrow morning." Rebecca frowned. "That's unnecessarily delayed." "The evaluation clearly supports Max's suitability for civilian placement, and my legal standing is unambiguous. There are procedural requirements for discharge of specialized assets," the behavioral specialist explained, though Margaret detected a note of apology in his tone. "Major Garrett is following protocol by conducting a comprehensive security review." As they were escorted from the facility, promise of tomorrow's meeting, the only concrete outcome of their visit, Margaret felt Emma's small hand slip into hers. The child who had been so animated during Max's evaluation had fallen silent again, her expression closed and distant in a way that painfully recalled the months after her parents' deaths. In the car, Rebecca's professional composure finally cracked. "This is about the mission," she said flatly, hands gripping the steering wheel. "Garrett was David's commanding officer. Whatever happened, whatever went wrong, Max is a living connection to it. As long as he exists, there's evidence that can't be completely buried." "But what could possibly have happened that would justify keeping a traumatized dog in military custody?" Margaret asked, glancing back to ensure Emma was absorbed in her drawing pad in the back seat. "What could Max have witnessed that would be worth all this?" Rebecca shook her head. "I don't know the details of the operation. David couldn't share them. But I know it was high-risk intelligence gathering in a region where we officially had no boots on the ground. And I know something went catastrophically wrong." She paused, then added quietly, "The official report states David died of injuries sustained in a helicopter training accident stateside. But his body was cremated before I could view it, and his personal effects were mysteriously delayed for weeks. When I finally received them, items were missing, including his personal journal and his private phone. The implications were disturbing. A falsified death report, missing personal effects, a specialized military dog who disappeared into a non-existent rehabilitation program only to resurface at a county shelter. "You think Major Garrett is covering up what really happened to your brother?" Margaret concluded softly. Rebecca's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I think Max is the only living witness to whatever happened on that mission. And someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure he disappears quietly." In the back seat, Emma had stopped drawing. Her small face appeared in the rearview mirror, solemn and far too understanding for her years. "Max knows," she said simply. "That's why we have to save him, not just for us, but for his first person too." The wisdom and compassion in this statement, from a child who had experienced her own profound loss, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Emma wasn't just fighting for her beloved dog. She was fighting for justice for a man she had never met, whose absence Max still mourned in his dog dreams. As they drove away from Fort Belvoir, the military base receding in the rearview mirror, Margaret made a silent promise, to Emma, to Max, and to the memory of Staff Sergeant David Mitchell. Whatever secrets lay buried, whatever powerful interests were at stake, they would not abandon Max to become another piece of classified history, filed away and forgotten. Tomorrow's meeting would determine not just Max's fate, but whether truth and justice could prevail against the formidable machinery of institutional self-protection. The odds seemed daunting, but Margaret had faced impossible situations before. In Vietnam field hospitals, in the aftermath of John's death, in the silent months following the accident that took Emma's parents and hearing. Sometimes, she reflected, watching her granddaughter's determined profile, the most important battles were fought not by soldiers or lawyers or politicians, but by ordinary people standing firm for those who couldn't speak for themselves. 6 months later, Margaret sat on her back porch, enjoying the crisp October morning. Autumn had painted the Virginia landscape in brilliant hues of amber, crimson, and gold, colors that reminded her of Max's intelligent eyes as he patrolled the perimeter of their fenced yard, his movements fluid and confident. So much had changed since that fateful day at Fort Belvoir when they had nearly lost him forever. The German shepherd who now supervised Emma's play in the fallen leaves bore little resemblance to the trembling creature they had discovered at the shelter. His coat gleamed with health, the gray around his muzzle lending him a distinguished air rather than marking him as damaged goods. "Watch this, Grandma," Emma called, her voice clear and strong. She signed a complex sequence of commands, and Max responded with impressive precision, navigating an obstacle course they had constructed from garden furniture and fallen branches. Margaret applauded, marveling at the transformation in her granddaughter as much as in the dog. Emma spoke regularly now, her confidence growing daily. The silent, withdrawn child who had retreated into herself after her parents' death had blossomed into a spirited 8-year-old with a passion for dog training and a determination to become a veterinarian for dogs like Max, who need special help. The journey to this peaceful morning had been anything but smooth. The final determination meeting at Fort Belvoir had begun as a near disaster, with Major Garrett arriving armed with additional security concerns that supposedly justified keeping Max in military custody indefinitely. His clinical pronouncements had been delivered with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having the final word, particularly in matters involving national security. What none of them had anticipated was Dr. Harrington's arrival, accompanied by a silver-haired gentleman in an impeccable suit whose military bearing and quiet authority had immediately altered the dynamics of the room. Margaret would never forget the look on Major Garrett's face when Captain Daniels had snapped to attention and addressed the newcomer as General Phillips. "I understand you've taken a personal interest in this particular military working dog, Thomas," the general had said, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "Given that MWD discharge decisions typically occur at the unit level without the involvement of intelligence officers, I found myself curious about your exceptional attention to this case." What followed had been a masterclass in military politics. Without ever directly challenging Major Garrett's authority or explicitly referencing classified operations, General Phillips had systematically dismantled the justification for keeping Max in military custody. Each security concern was acknowledged, examined, and meticulously redefined as a training characteristic that could be appropriately managed in civilian life under Rebecca Mitchell's knowledgeable supervision. "After all," the general had concluded with deceptive mildness, "we owe Staff Sergeant Mitchell's family every consideration. His service record was exemplary, as I'm sure you recall from your time as his commanding officer." The unspoken message had been clear. Whatever had happened on that final mission, whatever truths Major Garrett feared might emerge, the general knew enough to make continuing this battle unwise. 3 days later, Rebecca had arrived at Margaret's house with Max, official discharge papers, and a specialized training plan developed by the military's top canine behavioral specialist. The conditions of Max's release included monthly check-ins with a designated veterinary liaison and certain restrictions on public appearances. But the German Shepherd was officially retired from military service and legally adopted by Rebecca Mitchell. The surprise had come next. After signing the final paperwork transferring Max to her custody, Rebecca had turned to Margaret and Emma. David would want Max to be where he's needed most, she had said, her amber eyes, so like her brother's dogs, bright with emotion. I've seen how he is with Emma, how they heal each other. I can't separate them now. The arrangement they had worked out was unconventional but perfect. Max would live with Margaret and Emma, with Rebecca visiting regularly as his aunt and legal guardian. This compromise satisfied the military's requirement for supervision by qualified personnel, while allowing Max to remain with the child who had brought him back from the edge of despair. Their unusual family had expanded in unexpected ways. Frank Patterson had become a regular visitor, bringing dog biscuits and Vietnam War stories that Margaret found herself increasingly willing to hear. Dr. Harrington checked on Max's progress weekly, his professional interest gradually evolving into friendship with Margaret. Even Eleanor Whitfield had mellowed, her initial opposition to Max transforming into grudging respect after witnessing his gentle protectiveness toward Emma. Most surprising of all had been the connection with General Phillips, who had revealed himself as an old friend of Frank's from their intelligence service days. His intervention at Fort Belvoir had not been coincidental, but orchestrated through a complex network of veterans who believed in standing by their own, including the four-legged soldiers who served alongside them. The truth about Staff Sergeant David Mitchell's final mission remained classified, buried in redacted reports and sealed testimony. But in the months following Max's release, certain subtle shifts had occurred. Major Garrett had been reassigned to a desk position far from operational command. A congressional inquiry into the treatment of military working dogs had been quietly launched, with Rebecca providing expert testimony on improving transition protocols for canines with PTSD. And one evening, a plain envelope had arrived for Rebecca containing a single flash drive. She had never revealed its full contents to Margaret, but afterward something in her had seemed to settle, a restless questioning finally answered, if not resolved. What matters, she had told Margaret, is that David's story won't be completely erased. Someone, somewhere, knows what really happened and why it mattered enough to hide. That's something, at least. For Max, the diplomatic complexities surrounding his release had little relevance. His world had simplified to the essentials: protecting Emma, patrolling their territory, navigating the occasional thunderstorm with increasing confidence, and accepting the gentle guidance of the humans who had fought to give him a second chance. The nightmares that had once left him trembling in corners gradually diminished. The training that had made him a valuable military asset transformed into a foundation for new skills, alerting when Emma's hearing aids malfunctioned, providing pressure therapy during her occasional anxiety attacks, performing demonstrations at the local elementary school to teach children about service animals and disability awareness. "Grandma, can we show Max's new trick to Miss Rebecca when she comes tomorrow?" Emma asked, flopping onto the porch steps with Max settling contentedly beside her. "Of course," Margaret replied, smiling at the pair. "I'm sure she'll be very impressed." Rebecca's weekly visits had become a highlight for all of them. She brought news of her advocacy work, updates on the congressional hearings, and occasionally subtle messages from General Phillips about ongoing efforts to reform the military working dog program. For Emma, she represented a living connection to Max's mysterious past, someone who understood the parts of him that would always belong to another handler, another life. "Do you think Max still remembers his first person?" Emma asked, her small fingers absently stroking the German shepherd's ears. It was a question she returned to periodically, her child's mind grappling with concepts of memory, loss, and divided loyalties. "I think he carries David with him always," Margaret answered truthfully. "Just as you carry your parents in your heart. Remembering someone doesn't mean you can't love new people too." Emma nodded, absorbing this wisdom with the seriousness that occasionally reminded Margaret of all her granddaughter had endured in her short life. "I think that's why Max and I understand each other. We both know about the missing people. The simple profundity of this observation caught Margaret's breath. Before she could respond, the telephone rang inside the house. She rose to answer it, leaving Emma and Max basking in the autumn sunshine. Frank Patterson's voice greeted her when she picked up. "Morning, Margaret. Just checking if we're still on for the veterans group tomorrow. Several of the guys are looking forward to meeting Max and Emma." "Absolutely," Margaret confirmed. "Emma's been practicing their demonstration all week." The Veterans Support Group had been Frank's idea, a place where former service members could interact with Max in a controlled environment, experiencing the unique comfort that only a military dog could provide to those who understood the bond. For many of these veterans, Max represented something profound: resilience, recovery, the possibility of finding purpose after trauma. For Emma, these sessions offered opportunities to showcase Max's training while absorbing stories of courage and service that expanded her understanding of the world. Margaret had watched with quiet pride as her granddaughter blossomed into a natural handler, her intuitive connection with Max bridging communication gaps with veterans who sometimes struggled to express their experiences in words. "Eleanor called yesterday," Margaret mentioned, still marveling at the unlikely friendship that had developed between herself and her once adversarial neighbor. "She's organizing a fundraiser for the military working dog adoption program. Wants Max to make an appearance as the guest of honor." Frank chuckled. "From trying to ban him from the neighborhood to making him a celebrity. That woman never does anything halfway." After hanging up, Margaret returned to the porch to find Emma demonstrating a new hand signal to Max, who watched her with focused attention before executing a perfect response. "He's getting better at the complicated ones," Emma reported proudly. "Ms. Rebecca says he might qualify for therapy dog certification soon." The prospect of Max, once deemed too damaged for civilian life, becoming certified to help others struck Margaret as a perfect completion of the circle. From war to shelter to healing work, the German Shepherd's journey mirrored the resilience she had witnessed countless times during her nursing career. The wounded becoming healers, the broken becoming whole in new and unexpected ways. That evening, as autumn twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple and gold, they followed their established routine. Emma read aloud to Max from her school books, her confidence with spoken language growing stronger each day. Margaret prepared dinner, occasionally glancing through the kitchen window to observe their comfortable companionship. After dinner came Max's evening patrol, a ritual that satisfied his military training while ensuring their security. Emma accompanied him around the property's perimeter, signing all clear at regular intervals as the German Shepherd checked familiar landmarks. When bedtime arrived, Emma knelt beside Max's bed in her room. The dog had long since graduated from the living room to sleeping as Emma's guardian, and solemnly recited the special goodnight ritual they had developed. "Thank you for keeping us safe today," she said, her small hands moving in complimentary signs. "Thank you for being brave when things were scary. Thank you for helping me find my voice again." Max watched her with attentive devotion, his amber eyes reflecting the soft lamplight. When Emma finished with a gentle hug around his neck, he offered a soft whine and a gentle press of his muzzle against her cheek, his own good-night ritual. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep, Margaret sat in the living room with a cup of tea, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. On the mantel stood a framed photograph that Rebecca had given them. Staff Sergeant David Mitchell in desert camouflage, kneeling beside a younger Max, both of them alert and focused, bound by a connection forged in circumstances Margaret could barely imagine. Beside it stood a more recent image, Emma and Max at the community center demonstration, the German Shepherd's proud, bearing a perfect complement to the child's joyful confidence. Different partnerships, different bonds, but equally profound in their impact. A soft sound from the hallway drew Margaret's attention. Max stood in the doorway, his posture communicating quiet alertness rather than alarm. After a moment's consideration, He crossed to where Margaret sat and settled beside her chair with a contented sigh. "Checking on me?" Margaret asked, reaching down to stroke his fur. "I'm fine, old soldier, just counting our blessings." Max leaned slightly into her touch, his warm presence a comfort Margaret had come to rely on more than she had ever expected. The German shepherd, who had once belonged to war, now belonged to peace, to quiet evenings and joyful mornings, to a child's healing journey and a grandmother's renewed purpose. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering against the windows. Once, this sound would have sent Max into trembling retreat, memories of distant firefights triggered by the percussion of droplets against glass. Now he merely lifted his head, assessed the familiar sound, and settled back with calm acceptance. "You've come so far," Margaret murmured, remembering the trembling creature they had discovered at the shelter. "We all have." As if in agreement, Max rested his muzzle briefly on her knee, a gesture of connection he reserved for the humans he had accepted as his new pack. Then, with the quiet efficiency that characterized all his movements, he rose and returned to his post in Emma's room, guardian of her dreams. Tomorrow would bring Rebecca's visit, the veterans' group meeting, and the continuing evolution of their unconventional family. There would be challenges still. Max's occasional regression during particularly severe thunderstorms, Emma's moments of grief for her parents, the monthly check-ins with military representatives ensuring Max's continued adaptation. But tonight, in the peaceful house on Maple Street, those concerns belonged to a future they would face together. What remained in this moment was the simple truth Emma had articulated with a child's wisdom. Sometimes those society labels as broken understand each other best. Sometimes salvation comes not from experts or institutions, but from the recognition of shared wounds and the courage to heal together. The German shepherd who had trembled in a shelter corner and the little girl who had lost her voice had found in each other exactly what they needed most, not perfection, but understanding, not a return to what was lost, but the discovery of something new and equally precious. As the rain continued its gentle cadence against the windows, Margaret finished her tea and prepared for bed, secure in the knowledge that Max kept watch, that Emma slept peacefully, that the fragile family they had created against all odds had found its strength precisely in the places others had seen only damage. Some might call it coincidence that a military dog with PTSD and a hearing-impaired child grieving her parents had found each other at exactly the right moment. Margaret, who had witnessed too much suffering and too many small miracles to believe in mere chance, preferred to see it as evidence of a deeper pattern, a reminder that even in a broken world, healing connections emerge in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, she reflected as she passed Emma's room and glimpsed Max's silhouette keeping faithful vigil, those connections save us all. In a world that often overlooks the wisdom of experience, this story reminds us that our second chapters can be the most meaningful. Margaret's journey from Vietnam nurse to reluctant dog owner mirrors what many of us face: unexpected turns when we thought our defining moments were behind us. Like Max, we too can find new purpose after trauma. Remember when society valued the connections between generations? When neighborhoods rallied together for what mattered? This German shepherd and hearing-impaired child found healing in each other's brokenness, teaching us that our perceived weaknesses often become our greatest strengths. In our 50s and 60s, we understand that life's deepest relationships sometimes arrive when we least expect them. Perhaps you've experienced this, a connection that arrived after loss, bringing unexpected joy. What unexpected relationship has brought healing to your life when you needed it most? Has an animal companion ever understood you when humans couldn't? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, especially to those still searching for their Max or their Emma, someone who sees value in what others overlook. Your wisdom could be the guiding light someone needs today.